Some crimes remain unsolved for years, even decades. Case files gather dust in police archives while the perpetrators continue living their lives, starting families and enjoying freedom, a privilege their victims are deprived of. Today, I'll tell you about a killer who managed to evade justice for over a decade and a half. But even he ultimately faced retribution. Rebekah Gould was born on April 28, 1982 in the small town of Melbourne, Kansas, USA. With a population of barely 2,000 people, she was one of 4 daughters in the family. When the children were still very young, their parents decided to divorce. The process proved extremely unpleasant for all family members. The father made every effort to gain custody of his daughters, but the court sided with the mother. Despite the difficulties in separation, all the sisters maintained a relationship with their father. They were very close to each other and always took care of one another. As a teenager, Rebekah enrolled in a community college in Arkansas. To live closer to her place of study, she moved to the largest city of Fayetteville, with a population of around 100,000. Here, the girl pursued her education, worked part-time jobs, and prepared to enter university. Rebekah settled into an apartment with her younger sister Danielle, who was also her best friend. A couple weeks after moving, the sisters returned to their hometown of Melbourne to spend time with family and friends. 22-year-old Rebekah, after visiting with relatives, drove Danielle to her boyfriend's house and then went to see her own boyfriend Casey. At that point, they had been dating for about a year. Casey lived in a trailer located on his parents' property. They all had a wonderful weekend together. And then, little by little, they began getting ready to return to their usual work routines. On the morning of Monday, September 20, 2004, Rebekah drove her boyfriend to his job at a fast food restaurant. After that, the girl was seen buying breakfast. Rebekah stopped by a store where she ordered coffee and a sandwich. She planned to pack her things to head back home, where she and her sister were studying. Returning to her boyfriend's trailer, the girl decided to take a little nap, feeling exhausted after an almost sleepless night. Around noon, Rebekah was supposed to pick up Danielle from her boyfriend's place, but the younger sister waited in vain for the older one. The girl assumed Rebekah's plans had changed, so by evening she made her own way to their parents' house. There she gathered some things for the trip and went to bed. The next morning, Danielle hoped to meet her older sister, but she never returned. The girl called Casey, but he hadn't spent the night at home and knew nothing about his girlfriend's whereabouts. The young man was certain Rebekah was long home by now. Other friends and acquaintances also denied seeing her. Hoping to find out if something had happened to her sister, Danielle called the sheriff's department. She reported that the girl had gone missing a little less than 24 hours ago. The police were immediately interested in what happened. Investigators began working through possible scenarios, gathering information from the reporting party. After talking to her, they decided to speak with the last person who saw Rebekah before she disappeared. The police went to Casey's workplace, the missing girl's boyfriend, since he was the last one to see Rebekah. However, the young man told law enforcement that the night before he had stayed at a friend's house, and in the morning he went straight to work. He knew the girl was supposed to leave with her sister and wasn't expecting her to return. But the detectives were alarmed by Casey's decision, especially considering he had a dog that needed care. The young man couldn't leave it for long, although there was someone on his parents' property to look after the animal. The police had no evidence to confirm their suspicions, but investigators still decided to inspect the trailer where the missing girl's boyfriend lived. They requested his consent to search. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they immediately noticed Rebekah's car parked nearby. Inside the trailer, there was a sharp smell of bleach. All the missing girl's things were in place. Her purse, money, cell phone, even the breakfast she bought, the coffee and sandwich, remained untouched. It seemed as if the student hadn't gone anywhere at all. Even her dog, a Pomeranian, was there, which she definitely couldn't have left unattended for long. In the bedroom, the police noticed the heavily crumpled bedding. The duvet was found in the washing machine with traces of blood. A bottle of bleach stood by the bed. Detectives looked under the mattress and saw large fresh red stains on it. Obviously, someone had recently flipped it over, trying to hide these traces. After this discovery, law enforcement's suspicions only strengthened. An examination showed that the blood on the mattress and bedding belonged to the missing girl. Casey became the main suspect in Rebekah's disappearance and probable murder, given the amount of blood found in his trailer. However, several colleagues and the young man's management confirmed that on the day of the disappearance, at 8 a.m., the girl had dropped him off at work. She was whole and unharmed, after which she went about her business and didn't return. The young man worked until 4:30 p.m., and when his shift ended, friends picked him up in a car. This was seen by several witnesses. Casey went to the movies with his buddies for an evening showing, and then they headed straight to one of the friends' houses. The tired young man went to bed and didn't get up until the morning of September 21. From there, he went directly to the fast food restaurant. The friend also confirmed Casey's alibi. It seemed the young man had solid proof of his non-involvement, so there were no grounds for arrest. But investigators still didn't completely rule him out as a suspect. They continued carefully examining the crime scene. All the girl's things remained in the trailer, with the exception of the suitcase she usually took with her on trips. Police suspected that the body could have been hidden in it. Another interesting detail was the absence of one of the legs of the piano that stood in the trailer. According to Casey, this leg had long been loose and would fall off if you bumped the instrument, but he didn't know where it had gone. Maybe it rolled somewhere. Among the versions regarding Rebekah's disappearance, the possibility of her running off with her ex-boyfriend Justin was also considered. The police contacted him, but the young man assured that he had not seen the missing girl and had not maintained any relationship with her for a long time. Meanwhile, the search for Rebekah continued, and a week later, law enforcement received alarming news. On September 27, 2004, the body of the 22-year-old student was found in a ravine near the road. A random witness came across a pit formed by a mound, at the bottom of which lay the dead girl. The victim of the brutal attack was wearing only a t-shirt and underwear. During the autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Rebekah had died about a week ago. This meant that it was on Monday, September 20, after she dropped her boyfriend off at work, that an unknown criminal attacked and killed her. The girl received 2 separate blows to the head with a blunt object. The first broke her nose, and the second was fatal, fracturing her skull. Numerous bruises were found on Rebekah's body, indicating a brutal beating. Interestingly, the shape of the injuries matched the mark that could have been left by the broken leg of the piano, which was not found in Casey's trailer. It was considered the murder weapon, but this piece of evidence could not be found next to the body. The medical examiner found no signs of resistance, so the girl apparently did not expect the attack. So the attack on her was committed by someone she knew, or she was attacked from behind. There were also no signs of sexual assault, so that was not the motive for the crime. Among Rebekah's injuries, a fracture of the hyoid bone was recorded, indicating prolonged and forceful strangulation. After the body was discovered, law enforcement again turned their attention to Casey. Witnesses reported that the girl had long wanted to break up with him, considering the young man to be the main cause of problems in the relationship. His possessive attitudes provoked most of the conflicts, which only intensified after Rebekah moved to another city to study. However, Casey had a reliable alibi. Nevertheless, detectives and many local residents were convinced that he was guilty of the brutal attack, since the murder took place in his house. Investigators desperately tried to link Casey to this tragedy, so they carefully checked all the information about him. But at every stage, the young man had confirmation of his alibi. He was seen by colleagues at work. Benny spent time with friends. There were tickets and payment receipts left. The next morning, Casey showed up at work again and spent the whole day there. His alibi ruled out the possibility of him committing any criminal acts against Rebekah, with whom he couldn't even have crossed paths, unless he slipped away from work unnoticed, but detectives considered that probability too low. Casey worked in a fast food restaurant, constantly in plain sight, so his absence would have been noticed immediately. It was assumed that the girl could have been attacked not on Monday morning, but on Sunday evening, when the young man had no alibi. But here too a contradiction arose. Eyewitnesses claimed that it was Rebekah who brought her boyfriend to work in her car on Monday morning. Moreover, she then stopped by the store to buy breakfast, where she was also seen. The salesman remembered the girl buying a sandwich and a donut, which were later found in her boyfriend's trailer. This confirmed that the employee was not mistaken. So the version about the attack on Sunday had to be quickly discarded. Everything indicated that Rebekah returned to the trailer, and it was there or somewhere nearby that she was attacked. After all her things remained inside, but no signs of a break-in were found in the dwelling, which meant that the girl most likely opened the door herself to someone she knew, or the door wasn't locked at all. Of course, after Casey, other members of his family who lived on the property where the trailer stood fell under suspicion. They all could have communicated and seen the girl, in fact had free access to the young man's home. But it turned out that the father of the family was out of town during that period. He worked as a truck driver and was on an intercity route. Casey's siblings also provided alibis that were quickly confirmed. It turned out that none of his relatives living on the property could have attacked the girl. Meanwhile, the police continued to communicate with the main suspect, Casey, trying to find out new details about the last days of Rebekah's life. The young man admitted that on Sunday evening he saw his cousin, 27-year-old William Miller. He was passing by and stopped for a few minutes at the driveway to talk. Although the visit was brief, investigators latched onto this information. Everything indicated that the victim knew her killer, and it could have been anyone. It became known that William had come to town to help his mother move back from Texas. He arrived that same evening and was in the city during the period of the girl's disappearance, which looked suspicious. Could William have had a motive for committing the crime? To get more information, detectives spoke with him, but couldn't find out anything new. He only confirmed talking to his cousin on Sunday evening, after which he left without seeing Rebekah. Another suspect was a girl named Jenny Fertner, who had long been at odds with Rebekah over her ex-boyfriend Justin. But this time, too, the police failed to find evidence of her involvement in the attack. At the time of the murder, she had a reliable alibi. Gathering information about the last days of the deceased's life, detectives learned that she had met with a guy named J.B. Etsy. There was no romantic relationship between them, but the young man sold her marijuana, for which she owed him $20. Investigators thought he might well have been involved in the murder over money. But during the conversation with him, nothing suspicious was found. The guy claimed that he would never have killed a young girl, even for an amount many times greater than the $20 debt. He successfully passed a polygraph test, so he was released. Another person investigators spoke to was Chris Cantrell. There were several witnesses who claimed he had bragged about an attack on a young student. Of course, the detectives were immediately interested in him. But during interrogation at the police station, Chris denied these claims, and the witnesses with their contradictory statements could not be found. After checking this man, he was released for lack of evidence. Moreover, he had an alibi. After this episode, the investigation reached a dead end. Despite public anxiety and pressure from the victim's relatives, the process stalled and did not move forward for several years. During this time, Rebekah's parents constantly reminded about themselves, repeatedly asking for police documents on the case. But they were refused. Eventually, the parents hired a private detective, hoping he could shed light on the circumstances of their daughter's tragic death. But even the professional failed to uncover new details of the bloody attack. Rebekah's relatives even announced a $25,000 reward for information that would help find the killer. But even this did not move the investigation from a dead end. Only in the late 2010s did the case unexpectedly receive a new impetus. Several podcasts covered the girl's brutal murder, drawing public attention to the unsolved crime. In 2018, another episode dedicated to Rebekah's death was released. The host, who was originally from the area, invited the deceased's relatives and friends to talk. They shared their versions of what could have happened. During the interview, one of the witnesses provided shocking information. He personally heard Casey bragging about killing Rebekah. According to this person, they worked together, and one time, when the young man got drunk, he confessed to the deed. But the credibility of this testimony was in doubt. First, Casey's confession allegedly took place 8 years ago, when he was intoxicated. Moreover, the witness was also under the influence, and despite all this, for some reason he did not report what he heard to the police. It's quite possible that his story for the podcast was just an attempt to attract attention to himself, to get publicity. In addition, it turned out that this witness's wife had an affair with Casey, so the man could just be looking for a way to get back at his rival. However, even this dubious information forced detectives to return to the investigation and take up the case with renewed vigor. In 2020, a new special agent with the Arkansas State Police was ordered to reopen the investigation into Rebekah's murder. He decided to start from scratch. First of all, he interrogated everyone who could have been involved in the crime. During numerous conversations, the investigator only confirmed the old alibis, and suddenly it turned out that the only person who was in Casey's trailer shortly before Rebekah's death and had no alibi was his cousin William Miller. The police had spoken to him back in 2004, but at the time he denied any involvement in the murder. Since then, William had been completely forgotten about, but it turned out that over the years he had divorced his wife and moved to the Philippines. There he got into a relationship with another woman, with whom he started a new family and had 2 children. In the Philippines, William owned a large farm of about 12 hectares, where the family raised livestock and tended plantations that provided them with a livelihood. The couple's older son spoke English quite well, while the younger daughter knew only a few phrases, preferring the local Basere language. William himself worked in the oil industry and taught at the School of Equatorial Hygiene. The police suspected that his life abroad was actually related to an attempt to avoid paying taxes. After all, although he was an employee of a North American company, being outside the United States, he did not have to pay taxes. So William constantly shuttled between the Philippines, West Africa, and the United States. He visited his homeland to see relatives, get treatment, and periodically appeared at the office of the oil company he worked for. In any case, the new investigator who took over the investigation was eager to talk to this suspicious man. Unfortunately, due to his constant traveling, it was not easy to contact him. The detective had to be patient and wait for William's return. Intuition told him that Casey's cousin might know more about the brutal attack of 2004 than he had told at the time. Back in 2019, several journalists created a social media group dedicated to this unsolved crime. Interestingly, William joined it quite quickly. Of course, he had no idea that he was under the close attention of the police, because the details of the reopened investigation were kept secret. William's name did not appear in any of the podcasts, and no one outside considered him a suspect. He was a little-known member of Casey's family, with whom few people communicated closely. Therefore, this person was simply forgotten about, but for detectives, he had long been on the list of potential criminals. On the day of the murder, William had been in town for several days, helping his mother move, and in fact had access to Casey's trailer. It was this fact that caught the attention of the new investigator, and also the fact that shortly after the crime, the suspect left the country, which also looked strange. When William joined the social media group, he immediately aroused the interest of other members. The fact is that all the subscribers knew each other, had their own close-knit community, and then suddenly a man who lived so far away in the Philippines and could hardly know anything about this case joined, so his excessive interest seemed suspicious. At the same time, William demonstrated a surprisingly good knowledge of the circumstances of the murder, was literally obsessed with this topic, time after time commenting on the details of the student's death, sending newspaper clippings and eyewitness accounts that other group members did not have access to and which had not yet been made public. Community subscribers claimed that William talked about the place where the girl's body was found and also shared his suspicions that Casey's neighbors were involved in the crime. This greatly alarmed the other members of the group. One of the girls, who was well versed in genealogy, analyzed the information and found that William was the cousin of the deceased's boyfriend. This discovery caused alarm in everyone. After considering the situation, the community members decided to pass the collected information to the Arkansas State Police. Law enforcement officials were interested in this information. William's behavior his joining the group, his obsessive discussion of the murder theme resembled the actions of a criminal who monitors the progress of the investigation and tries to lead the investigation in the wrong direction. But the police's hands were tied because the suspect was in another country and there was no way to interrogate him. Although there was an extradition agreement between the USA and the Philippines, more compelling grounds were needed to extradite a person. All that remained was to wait for William to return to the States on his own. In order not to miss his arrival, law enforcement officials warned the customs services. The man's passport was entered into the appropriate database. It was assumed that the system would automatically report his appearance at the border, and then customs officers would quickly contact the police. And so it happened. In October 2020, William flew to Arkansas to visit his family, who now lived there. The detective learned of his arrival. When police called the suspect's mother, she assured that her son had not appeared in the country for over a year. But this was a lie because law enforcement officials already knew that he had crossed the US border. Later, the woman explained her insincerity by the fact that she did not believe in the conversation with the police and thought that some ill wishers of William were trying to find him. Eventually, the police managed to arrange a meeting with William at the station on November 7, which he attended. Finding himself in the interrogation room, the suspect immediately declared his readiness to cooperate and provide any information necessary for the investigation. He assured that he had nothing to hide. Despite the fact that the man was suspected of murder, the detectives initially decided not to focus on this. The conversation began casually, from afar, with innocent questions in order to win over the suspect and give him the opportunity to open up. At first, the investigators were interested in William's current life and his frequent moves. He talked about his busy schedule and life, gradually relaxing. Further, the detectives showed interest in his work, place of residence and daily routine at the time of Rebekah's murder. William reported that he was then working on a 7-on-7-off schedule, that is, a week of 10-12 hours a day, and then the same amount of rest. Shortly before the tragic death of the student, his mother moved from Arkansas to Texas, and he helped her with the move. But she did not like the new state, so the woman decided to return back. William used one of his weeks off to help his mother return home. That is why he found himself in the city during the period when Rebekah Gould was murdered. The police gradually approached the most important questions. It turned out that William was not very close to his cousins, although they occasionally met and communicated. According to him, he had been to his cousin's trailer only a few times, but did not remember this happening in 2004. Then the police tried to clarify the circumstances of William's meeting with Casey in September 2004. He confirmed that he did visit him while living in the house with his mother. According to the suspect, he had little communication with his cousin because he was constantly working. William saw him and the girl only in the evening, and it seemed to him as if they had some kind of quarrel. However, this aroused even more suspicion, because the young people's loved ones claimed that they did not quarrel that evening. William said that he had been to his cousin's trailer several times, but did not mention to the police about communicating with him on September 19, the day before Rebekah's death. He kept silent about this until the very end, and the detectives also did not tell him about their awareness. They tried to lead the suspect to a confession. According to William, he arrived in Kansas only on the evening of Sunday, September 19, when it was already getting dark, and stayed with his mother. In the morning, they took his younger brother to school together, and then spent the whole day packing things. On Tuesday, William rented several trucks for the move. It was during this period that police officers who came to search began working around his cousin's trailer. But he never mentioned seeing Casey and Rebekah. After that, the detectives told about their awareness of the communication between Casey and William on September 19, 2004. However, the suspect began to deny that he did not remember exactly and suggested that this meeting took place at a different time. The detectives continued to maintain a relaxed atmosphere and asked the man to provide DNA samples. He immediately refused, explaining that his DNA could have remained on the furniture items during his cousin's visit. The detectives explained to William that they would compare the DNA not with samples from the furniture, but with specific physical evidence from the crime scene, but they still could not convince him. In fact, no DNA of the killer was found at the crime scene, so the detectives just wanted to check his reaction. At the same time, the suspect agreed to take a polygraph test. Before the test began, he was clearly nervous. William claimed that he was taking medications that affected his blood pressure, so he was afraid of the low accuracy of the results. However, in reality, such problems do not affect the effectiveness of the test, which he was informed about. The polygraph examiner managed to calm the suspect down, but this did not help him successfully pass the test. William failed the polygraph, which automatically increased the police's suspicions. The interrogation continued. The investigators were determined to break the suspect. To do this, they used the same tactic that they used on Casey in the first year after the girl's murder. Then they photographed his car and tried to convince the young man that Rebekah's blood was found on the gas pedal. Of course, this was a trick to get the criminal to give himself away, but it didn't work with Casey. He continued to argue that it was possible, so the police assumed that the young man was indeed innocent. To pull the same thing on William, they had to track down and photograph his old pickup truck, which he owned at the time of the crime. When the police played the same trick, informing him that Rebekah's blood was found on the pedal of his car, it worked. The man suddenly began to stutter, get confused in his testimony. He was even more nervous, and his story instantly changed. As soon as the suspect believed that Rebekah's blood was found in his old car, he said that on the day of the crime he saw an unknown young man. He arrived in a white car, which he left near the back porch of the house. William saw the suspicious man quickly disappear from the scene alone, and he thought that his cousin's trailer had been robbed. When he ran inside to make sure of this, he saw not the consequences of a robbery, but blood on the bedding. In his opinion, Rebekah was attacked and kidnapped, and then probably killed. Of course, the detectives could not believe it, because according to his confession, the criminal acted alone. Moreover, there was no reason to hide this information for 16 years. When he was exposed in a lie, William stated that he was ready to confess. According to him, on Monday morning he went hunting in the woods behind his grandfather's house. He knocked on the trailer where Rebekah was and asked to use the phone. Suspecting nothing, the girl let him in. However, this was a trick because he wanted to hunt for more interesting prey Rebekah. He was very nervous, so he accidentally touched the piano, and its leg broke off and fell. Then he grabbed the girl and beat her half to death, and then strangled her with golf clubs to make sure she was dead. After the massacre, he packed the body in a suitcase. He cleaned up the crime scene, collected the bloody bedding, sent some of it to the laundry. He turned the mattress over, took the body out in his pickup truck and threw it into a ravine. Moreover, on the way, he drove past the police station, not even afraid that he might be noticed or accidentally stopped. On the way back, he got rid of the piano leg and suitcase, indicating the place. The criminal just continued to live as if nothing had happened. He returned home in such a way that his mother did not even notice her son's absence while packing things. Then they made the move as planned. The motives for the brutal murder of Rebekah remained a mystery. William categorically denied any intentions to abuse the girl. Valuables were also not stolen from the crime scene. The suspect claimed that it was a spontaneous attack of aggression that got out of control. According to him, Rebekah did not provoke or offend him in any way, so there were no obvious reasons for the attack. William just wanted to shed someone else's blood. For a long time, the police were puzzled by one question. Why did William, having arrived in the Philippines and learning from his mother about the officer's call, not run away, but agreed to meet with the detectives? The man admitted that for many years he had been lying to everyone about this incident in order to make sure of his inviolability. He was absolutely sure that his involvement in the crime could not be proven. Therefore, without any hesitation, William appeared at the police station, hoping to finally remove all suspicions from himself and live carefree on. When the suspect was finally exposed, the investigators decided to use another cunning trick. The criminal acted too confidently, methodically, and accurately. There was a suspicion that William might have other crimes behind him. The detectives hinted to him that they were aware of his involvement in a number of other murders. Surprisingly, this tactic worked. As it turned out, this seemingly ordinary family man and father was a real serial killer. According to William himself, he took the life of his first victim at the age of 20. Since then, the man had constantly stalked pretty blonde girls, whom he brutally beat and strangled to death. Police officers unfolded a map of the area in front of the suspect. William, without hesitation, marked several points on it where, according to him, the bodies of the dead girls could be found. In total, he indicated 6 burial sites of the victims. 4 of them, according to the killer, were girls of easy virtue, and 2 were random passers by whom he chose for no apparent reason. Later, William let slip that in addition to these victims, there could be 5 more girls whose disappearances occurred under similar circumstances. According to the suspect, he never robbed his victims. He chose girls who provided intimate services only because they were easy to lure into a trap, and hardly anyone would look for them after they disappeared. He admitted that he felt incredible excitement at the moment when the victims undressed, and then suddenly attacked from behind and strangled them with their own clothes. At this point, William's revelations about the fate of other victims stopped. He no longer wanted to talk to the investigators. The court took into account all the evidence, and the man was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to release.
Courtney Clenny, a young and attractive blonde who craved fame, found herself at the center of a scandal due to the tragic death of her boyfriend, Christian. Despite the girl's and her lawyer's claims of self-defense, the evidence gathered during the investigation points to a deliberate murder committed by Courtney. From the age of 13, Courtney, whose real name is Courtney Clenny, had a clear plan for achieving popularity. After moving with her family to Austin, Texas, she began her journey in show business by participating as an extra in films. The girl dreamed of becoming a Hollywood star and did not miss any opportunity, appearing in commercials for well-known brands such as Pepsi. The pursuit of fame and popularity from a young age can often lead to disastrous consequences, especially when ambition outweighs common sense and moral principles. Courtney understood that her attractiveness and charisma were powerful tools for attracting attention. She actively developed her career, appearing in music videos of popular performers and posing for the men's magazine Playboy. Later, she managed to land a few small roles on television and in movies. Along with her career in the entertainment industry, Courtney became passionate about fitness. Moving to Los Angeles in 2017 was a turning point. Her popularity on Instagram skyrocketed, turning the girl into a millionaire blogger. Subscribers admired her perfect body and dedication to a healthy lifestyle. However, behind the ideal image on social media, there were problems in Courtney's personal life. Her relationship with Christian, which began in 2020, quickly grew from passion into a toxic mix of jealousy, control, and aggression.
Despite the luxurious apartment in Miami and the seemingly carefree life, behind the scenes of the relationship, scandals and violence were raging. Courtney Clenny, in her pursuit of popularity, did not miss any opportunity. Starting from 2015, she began appearing in music videos of famous artists. It was an important step in her career, as it allowed her to gradually move from being an extra to more prominent roles in advertisements and music videos. The path to fame is rarely easy and often requires gradual advancement, taking advantage of every opportunity. At the same time, Courtney posed for the men's magazine Playboy, which undoubtedly added to her recognition. Later that year, she managed to land a few small roles on television and in movies, which was another step in her career. However, Courtney did not limit herself to just the entertainment sphere. She also became passionate about fitness and decided to try her hand in this field. In 2017, the girl took a bold step moving to Los Angeles. This decision turned out to be fateful, as her popularity on Instagram skyrocketed, turning Courtney into a millionaire blogger. Subscribers were delighted with the beautiful and athletic girl who regularly shared her workouts and achievements. Courtney herself admitted that she was inspired by the example of another fitness model and decided to follow in her footsteps, participating in various fitness competitions. At these events, Courtney's body looked flawless, evoking admiration from the audience. Courtney's popularity on social media continued to grow rapidly, but it was not enough for the girl. She craved even greater fame and scale. It seemed that Courtney was ready to do anything to achieve her goal, and nothing could stand in the way of her ambitions. Unrestrained thirst for fame can cloud the mind and force a person to cross the line of what is allowed. It is important to stop in time and think about the price that will have to be paid for one's aspirations. In her pursuit of even greater popularity and financial success, Courtney Clenny decided to take a bold step, create an account on the OnlyFans platform. This social network allows users to create closed communities where subscribers get access to exclusive content for a monthly fee. Most often, the most popular content on OnlyFans is adult material. Platforms like OnlyFans can become a tempting way for young and ambitious people to get rich quick. However, it is important to understand the potential risks and consequences associated with producing and distributing adult content. Courtney created her OnlyFans profile under the pseudonym Courtney Clenny, maintaining some anonymity. In her profile description, she stated that she works as a full-time fitness model and has two beloved dogs, Jessie and Ranger. The girl was fully aware of her attractiveness and charisma, which would help her attract and retain the attention of subscribers. According to some reports, Courtney managed to earn over $3 million thanks to OnlyFans alone. This impressive amount testifies to her popularity and the willingness of fans to pay for access to her content. Financial success on platforms like OnlyFans can create the illusion of easy money and endless opportunities. In March 2022, shortly before committing a terrible crime, Courtney became a guest on the comedy podcast We're Not Miami. During the interview, she jokingly called herself a crazy toxic girlfriend. Although it sounded like a joke, there is often a grain of truth in such statements. This statement by Courtney may indicate her awareness of her own problematic character traits and unhealthy patterns of behavior in relationships. Perhaps she considered her toxicity and craziness as something attractive or even funny, not realizing the real consequences of such an attitude. Self-irony and jokes about one's own shortcomings can be a way to hide real problems and avoid responsibility for one's actions. It is important to take alarming signals in a person's behavior seriously, even if they are presented in the form of jokes. The We're Not Miami podcast became a kind of harbinger of the tragic events unfolding in Courtney Clenny's life. Her joke about craziness and toxicity turned out to be a chilling prediction of the future, which, unfortunately, became a reality. During her appearance on the podcast, Courtney Clenny was quite frank about her preferences in men. Without any hesitation, she stated that she prefers to date exclusively wealthy black guys. Moreover, Courtney emphasized her dislike for any control or instructions from a partner, which indicates her independent and strong-willed character. Such candid statements about racial and financial preferences when choosing a partner may indicate a superficial attitude towards relationships and a potential tendency towards mercantilism. The victim in this tragic story was Christian, also known as Toby Obums. Like Courtney, he was originally from Texas, but relatively little information is available about him. From the available data on social networks, it is known that Christian studied communications at Texas Tech University and was engaged in trading. Courtney and Christian met and started dating around 2020. Initially, they lived together in a hotel, but later moved to a luxurious apartment in a 53-story building in Miami. Their residence was located on the 23rd floor with a stunning view of the waterfront. The couple enjoyed all the advantages of a wealthy life, including a private elevator that took them directly to the door of their apartment. Despite Courtney's active presence on social media and her growing popularity, Christian was much more restrained in his online activities. He rarely appeared in public, and even in videos with Courtney, his presence was minimal. This may indicate his unwillingness to be in the spotlight or a certain discomfort with the publicity of their relationship. It seems quite strange that despite living together in a luxurious apartment in Miami, Courtney and Christian never flaunted their relationship on social media. Perhaps it was a conscious decision of the couple or evidence of certain problems in their relationship that they tried to hide from prying eyes. The discrepancy between the public image and the real state of affairs in a relationship is often an alarming signal. If people excessively hide their personal life or avoid demonstrating their relationship, it may indicate the presence of serious problems or even abusive patterns of behavior. The luxurious apartment where Courtney Clenny and Christian Oboms lived was registered exclusively in the girl's name. According to available information, the monthly rent for this residence reached an impressive $10,000. At first glance, the couple enjoyed an ideal life of luxury and prosperity. However, behind the closed doors of their relationship, serious problems were hidden, invisible to the outside eye. An alarming signal about the unhealthy state of Courtney and Christian's relationship was the information about numerous police calls to their apartment. In the period from January 2022, when the couple moved into the apartment, until the moment of the tragedy, law enforcement officers were called at least 7 times. It is striking that all these incidents occurred within just 4 months of living together. On April 6, 2022, the world was shaken by the news of a brutal murder in this luxurious skyscraper. The media reported a fatally wounded man, but the name of the suspect in the crime had not yet been revealed. The police discovered the body of a 27-year-old victim with a fatal stab wound. Later, friends recognized the deceased as Christian Oboms and provided law enforcement with information that he lived in this building with his girlfriend, Courtney Clenny. The tragic death of a young person is always a great loss and shock for loved ones. It is especially chilling to realize that the murder took place in a place that was supposed to be a safe haven, one's own home. Initially, friends characterized Christian as a smart and energetic guy. However, as new details about his relationship with Courtney emerged, it became clear that behind the external gloss, there were serious problems. It turned out that the couple had experienced instances of both physical and moral abuse from both sides. In particular, one of the neighbors claimed to have witnessed Christian raising his hand against Courtney. At the same time, the couple's friends spoke of instances when they saw Courtney hit Christian. Domestic violence is a serious problem that, unfortunately, is often hushed up and ignored. Victims often feel ashamed or afraid to talk about their experiences, especially when the aggressor is their partner. It is important to remember that violence can never be justified, and everyone deserves a healthy and safe relationship. These testimonies paint a chilling picture of a toxic and abusive relationship that led to a tragic denouement. Despite the outward glitz and glamour, behind the doors of Courtney and Christian's apartment, a real drama unfolded, full of pain, suffering, and violence. Despite the perfect picture that Courtney Clenny and Christian Oboms displayed on social media, the reality of their relationship was far from a fairy tale. It is enough to look behind the scenes of the glossy photos to discover the chilling truth, a toxic relationship full of violence and manipulation. One should not blindly trust the ideal images that people present online, because reality can be much darker and more painful. When information about Christian's potential killer became public, Courtney wasted no time and immediately hired a lawyer named Frank Prieto. The defense attorney immediately stated that the girl acted exclusively in self-defense and was herself a victim of domestic violence by Christian. Prieto claimed that on the day of the tragedy, Christian broke into the apartment without Courtney's permission, since the residence was registered only in her name, and the couple was allegedly separated and not living together at that time. The lawyer insisted that Christian's only purpose when he illegally burst into the apartment was to commit violent acts against Courtney. According to the defense attorney, the former partners had broken up a month before the horrible incident. Courtney's mother said that her daughter was afraid to even leave the house, as her ex-boyfriend was constantly trying to break down the door, and when he failed to do so, he slept right on the stairwell, waiting for an opportunity to get inside. Obsession and stalking by former partners is a serious problem that can escalate into tragedy.
Victims often feel helpless and frightened, not knowing how to protect themselves from the aggressor. A few days before the tragic incident, the police were called to Courtney and Christian's apartment. Law enforcement officers noticed bruises on the girl's arms and legs, which could indicate the use of physical force. According to the defense version, Courtney stabbed Christian only after he knocked her to the floor and tried to grab her by the throat. This situation allegedly forced the girl to resort to radical measures to save her own life. However, despite all the lawyers' arguments, many questions and doubts remained about the veracity of this version of events. Was Courtney really a victim defending herself from an attacker, or was there something more sinister and premeditated behind it? Write your opinion in the comments. Christian Obens's family was shocked and outraged by the statements of Courtney Clenny's lawyer about self-defense. They categorically refused to believe that the knife wound that led to the death of their son and brother was justified and necessary for protection. Loved ones described Christian as a caring, kind, and athletic guy who could not pose a threat to his girlfriend. As it became known, the murder occurred on April 3, 3 days before the media picked up this news and it gained publicity. According to the autopsy results, Christian received a penetrating stab wound to the chest, which caused him fatal injuries. The blade entered the body to a depth of 7.5 centimeters, which indicates the force and intent of the blow. However, Courtney Clenny's behavior after the incident raised even more questions and outrage from the public. On October 8, just 5 days after she killed her boyfriend, the girl was spotted in a bar in Miami with her father. It seemed that she felt quite well and did not show any signs of stress or worries about what had happened. Such brazen and carefree behavior of a murder suspect is shocking and outrageous. It is hard to believe that a person who has just taken the life of their partner can return to their usual way of life so quickly, as if nothing had happened. This may indicate a lack of remorse, empathy, and awareness of the consequences of one's actions. One of the bar patrons who knew about the murder situation filmed a viral video in which he tried to shame and expel Courtney from the establishment. In the recording, you can hear the woman being indignant at the fact that the suspect in the murder came to drink and have fun as if everything was fine. This video quickly gained popularity on the web, and in the comments, people expressed the same feelings of anger and indignation at Courtney's act. Viewers could not understand how a girl who had cold-bloodedly killed her boyfriend just a few days ago could be so mentally balanced and carefree. Her behavior defied common sense and raised many questions about her true role and motives in this terrible crime. One of the most outrageous aspects of this case for the public was that Courtney Clenny was not arrested immediately after the incident. Instead of ending up behind bars, the girl continued to live her usual life as if nothing had happened. In June 2022, she returned to her hometown of Austin to be closer to her parents. There, Courtney bought a luxurious house worth almost $1.5 million and transferred the same amount to her father's account. People could not understand how a girl who had just taken another person's life could continue her existence so carelessly, as if nothing had happened. It seemed that Courtney did not expect any consequences for what she had done and felt absolutely unpunished. Another detail that constantly attracted public attention was the racial aspect of this case. A beautiful white girl killed her black boyfriend and did not face punishment for it. In society, and especially among Christians' relatives and friends, there was a growing sense of injustice and the existence of certain privileges for an attractive white woman. Racial inequality and bias in the justice system is a painful and long-standing problem in our society. When a criminal avoids punishment because of their skin color, status, or appearance, it undermines trust in the law and generates feelings of helplessness and anger among the victims and their loved ones. An interesting fact was that Courtney's father, as it turned out, was unaware of his daughter's account on the OnlyFans website. This is a platform where users can share explicit content with their subscribers for money. Considering that Courtney had huge wealth and could afford to buy a house for $1.5 million, the question arises, how did her father explain to himself the origin of this money? This detail adds even more confusion and suspicion to an already convoluted and chilling story. Did Courtney's father know about her real life and sources of income? Or was he perhaps part of some scheme himself or covering up his daughter's illegal activities? The long-awaited arrest of Courtney Clenny took place on August 10, 2022 in Hawaii, where she was staying in a rehabilitation center. The reason for her stay in the facility was substance abuse and post-traumatic stress disorder. After being detained, Courtney was taken to Florida, where the next day, August 11, she was officially arrested on charges of second-degree murder.
Now let's consider the official version of the events of that fatal day and the timeline, according to the prosecution. On Sunday, April 3, 2022, Christian Obams left the apartment he shared with Courtney in Miami around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Later, at 4:23 p.m., he returned home with sandwiches for himself and his girlfriend. An interesting fact is that shortly before Christian's return, namely at 4:01 p.m., Courtney was live streaming on Instagram for her followers. In the video, she was wearing the same clothes that the police later photographed her in after the incident. This detail caught the attention of many people working on the case, as Courtney's behavior seemed strange and inadequate. The fact that the suspect was acting so carefree and relaxed shortly before the tragedy raises many questions. Could she have been planning something terrible while being live, or was it perhaps an attempt to create an alibi? Or maybe her strange behavior was the result of using some substances that affected her consciousness and actions. Many people had the feeling that Courtney was under the influence of psychoactive substances during the live stream. Her manner of communication, gestures, and facial expressions seemed unnatural and strange. This observation only heightened suspicions about her possible involvement in the subsequent tragic events. The question remains open. Was this live stream a spontaneous decision by Courtney, or perhaps part of some sinister plan? Was she trying to deflect suspicion from herself in this way, or create an impression of normality before committing a terrible crime? On that fatal day, Courtney noticed that Christian had turned off the location tracking on his phone when he went out for sandwiches. This detail became another reason for conflict, as jealousy and distrust were constant companions in their relationship. When Christian returned a few hours later, he turned the geolocation back on, but it did not appease Courtney. Obsession with a partner and the desire to control their every step are clear signs of a toxic and abusive relationship. When trust disappears and jealousy becomes all-consuming, it can lead to tragic consequences. Between 4:43 p.m. and 4:49 p.m., Courtney called her mother twice. The first conversation lasted 6 minutes and the second 7 minutes. And it was in the interval between these calls that the irreparable happened. Courtney struck Christian with a serrated kitchen knife. Courtney's mother claimed that she heard her daughter repeating that Christian was lying about something. This phrase may indicate a tense atmosphere and a conflict that was unfolding at that moment. Only at 4:57 p.m. did Courtney finally call 911, summoning an ambulance. At the same time, neighbors, alarmed by the noise, reported the incident to the building's security service, which in turn called the police. The delay in calling emergency services after a violent incident always raises suspicions. Why didn't Courtney immediately call 911 if it was self-defense? Every minute was worth its weight in gold when it came to saving Christian's life. It seems strange that between the attack on Christian and the 911 call, Courtney contacted her mother again. Perhaps she was seeking support or advice in this critical situation, while her boyfriend was bleeding out. When medics arrived at the crime scene, Christian had already lost a lot of blood. Despite all the efforts of the doctors, his life could not be saved. He died in the hospital. During questioning, Courtney categorically denied inflicting knife wounds on Christian. Instead, she claimed that it was Christian who attacked her, and she, defending herself, threw a knife at him from a distance of about 3 meters. According to her, she did not intend to harm him, but only wanted to scare him. Courtney's version of self-defense and accidentally throwing a knife from a distance of 3 meters seems highly doubtful. Firstly, hitting a moving person with a knife from such a distance is practically impossible without special training. Secondly, the nature of the wounds indicated a targeted strike at close range, not an accidental hit. The forensic expert who performed the autopsy on Christian's body also refuted Courtney's version. In his professional opinion, inflicting such a knife wound from a distance of 3 meters could only be done by a professional knife thrower, not an ordinary girl. However, Courtney continued to insist on her testimony. Interestingly, despite the seemingly luxurious and carefree life of the couple, there are several strange facts in their biography. For example, a few months before the incident, Courtney was behind on rent for the luxurious apartment. The matter went so far that on March 21, 2022, the Miami court issued a decision to evict her for non-payment. A logical question arises. If Courtney was really earning such big money, why couldn't she pay for the housing she herself chose to live in? There are also some facts from Courtney's past that draw attention. In 2018, another woman from Austin sued her for inflicting bodily injuries and material damage as a result of a car accident. This case was settled out of court.
And in 2022, shortly before the tragedy with Christian, Courtney was arrested in Texas for driving under the influence. This was already the second such offense in her biography. Although these incidents are not directly related to Christian's murder, they demonstrate certain behavioral patterns and problems with the law in Courtney's life. A propensity for aggressive driving and alcohol abuse may indicate general instability and destructive tendencies. Friends of the couple said that at the beginning of the relationship, Courtney and Christian were truly in love and happy. But over time, their relationship became toxic and unhealthy. Constant quarrels, jealousy, insults, and even physical violence became common companions of their life together. The couple regularly broke up and got back together, unable to break this vicious cycle. Any little things could become a reason for conflict, such as Christian looking at another girl. Courtney, who abused alcohol, became especially aggressive and uncontrollable at such moments. Christian's friends noticed that due to constant scandals and insults from the girl, he became more withdrawn and distant. Courtney herself actively tried to isolate the guy from his family and friends. Acquaintances of the couple also told about repeated cases of physical violence by Courtney. She could push, hit, or even spit in Christian's face during an argument. Once, the girl even pushed him down the stairs at a house party. In moments of particular rage, Courtney would literally smash everything around her like a hurricane. Despite this, Christian continued to believe in the relationship and hope for the best. He wrote messages to Courtney saying that he loved her and wanted to work on the relationship. Moreover, when the girl's career took off, Christian became her personal assistant. He helped with the shooting schedule, organizing photo shoots, and so on. Courtney even promised him a percentage of the income from her OnlyFans page. Christian's behavior is a typical example of an abuse victim who continues to justify their abuser and hope for change. He was emotionally dependent on Courtney and could not break out of the toxic bond, despite the numerous manifestations of aggression on her part. From time to time, Courtney seemed to try to make amends for the violence with generous gifts for Christian. However, this was more manipulation than sincere remorse. Verbal apologies from the girl were out of the question. Instead, she created the illusion that expensive presents could compensate for the insults and pain inflicted, and Christian fell into this trap again and again. This pattern of behavior is a typical cycle of violence in abusive relationships. Periods of escalation and aggression are replaced by a honeymoon phase, when the abuser tries to make amends with gifts and promises to change. But without awareness of the problem and professional help, this only leads to an escalation of the conflict. Christian's friends also noted that the more fame and money Courtney gained, the less often she was sober. The girl abused not only alcohol, but also, probably, narcotic substances. This only intensified her unstable emotional state and outburst of aggression. One of the most shocking videos that sheds light on the true nature of the relationship between Courtney Clenny and Christian Obams was captured by a surveillance camera in the private elevator of their building. In the recording, it is clearly visible how Courtney repeatedly hits Christian in the face and also aggressively pulls his hair. At the same time, Christian does not resist and even tries to calm the enraged girl. This video recording is indisputable evidence of domestic violence by Courtney. The fact that such incidents occurred even in public places, such as an elevator, indicates a sense of complete impunity and lack of boundaries in her behavior. Christian's reaction is a typical example of an abuse victim trying to avoid escalation of the conflict by appeasing the aggressor. But the most shocking revelation was that 2 months before Christian's murder, in February 2022, Courtney cheated on him. It turns out that her own infidelity and guilt were the real reason for the morbid jealousy and control towards Christian. By projecting her own unfaithfulness onto her partner, Courtney was probably trying to justify her own destructive behavior. This betrayal became another reason for a scandal, during which Courtney grabbed a knife and tried to injure Christian in the face. Although she did not manage to hit the target, she cut his throat instead. The wound turned out to be quite serious, and Christian had to have stitches. In addition to physical violence, Courtney regularly kicked Christian out of their shared apartment and humiliated him with racist insults. This behavior is a manifestation not only of the toxicity of the relationship, but also of deeply rooted prejudices and discrimination. Despite all these alarming facts, Courtney's lawyers persistently tried to get her released on bail before the start of the trial. During the court hearings in December, the girl displayed ostentatious emotionality and cried in front of the jury. Her defense built a strategy on the fact that the murder of Christian was an act of self-defense, and Courtney herself became a victim of domestic violence. However, the judge did not succumb to these manipulations and denied release on bail.
attempts to present Courtney as a victim, despite numerous evidence of her aggressive and controlling behavior, is a typical defense tactic in such cases. Manipulation of emotions, attempts to shift the blame onto the victim, all this is designed to sow doubt in the jury and gain leniency. But the facts remain facts, and they are clearly not on Courtney's side. At the time of the tragedy on April 3, 2022, there was no doubt that it was Courtney Clenny who took Christian Obam's life. The only question that still needed an answer was whether it was a premeditated murder or an act of self-defense. Courtney herself continued to insist on her innocence and shift responsibility onto the victim.
Currently, the girl is in a Florida prison awaiting the final verdict of the court. Her behavior during interrogations raises many questions and surprises. Before the investigator arrived, Courtney talked to herself and allegedly prayed for Christian, although her clothes were completely soaked in his blood. When the detective finally appeared, she apologized for her appearance, as if that was the biggest problem at that moment. Even stranger was Courtney's reaction to the news of Christian's death. When a law enforcement officer informed her of this news, she began to dramatically gasp for air and grab her head. Although people react differently to grief, her behavior seemed unnatural and exaggerated. And the most shocking moment was when Courtney asked to hug one of the investigators, as if seeking comfort and support from him. Courtney's behavior during the interrogation raises many questions about her mental state and the sincerity of her emotions. Her actions seem strange, inadequate to the situation, and possibly calculated to evoke sympathy. But knowing the backstory of her relationship with Christian, these attempts at manipulation look especially cynical and outrageous. Throughout the interrogation, Courtney kept repeating that she needed to hug her mom, that the detectives were joking with her, and that this was all just some terrible dream. She refused to acknowledge the reality of what had happened and take responsibility for what she had done. Christian's family, filled with grief and indignation, filed a civil lawsuit against Courtney. They demand compensation from her for all expenses related to the funeral and court proceedings. But most importantly, they seek justice and recognition of the suffering they endured through the loss of a son and brother. Courtney's lawyers, in turn, continue to appear on television and insist on the version of self-defense, portraying their client as a victim of circumstances. Attempts by the defense to present Courtney as a victim in this story look particularly cynical against the backdrop of all the evidence gathered. Even if we assume that there was mutual violence in their relationship, the facts indicate that it was Courtney who is the main aggressor and the toxic element. Her desire to control, humiliate, and dominate her partner cannot be justified by any circumstances. Undoubtedly, this case will long be the subject of discussion and research. Perhaps experts will never be able to come to an unambiguous conclusion about who is the main abuser in this relationship. But now, when Courtney is behind bars awaiting a verdict, her attempts to manipulate the system and public opinion look particularly unacceptable. Regardless of the final decision of the court, this tragic story should serve as a reminder to all of us about the importance of healthy, safe, and equal relationships. Domestic violence, toxicity, and abuse are problems that require serious attention and decisive action from society. We cannot allow such situations to remain without proper response and punishment for the guilty. Only in this way can we prevent new victims and build a more harmonious world for all. On March 7, 2019, something horrific and mysterious happened in the Nevada desert. A local man driving through the desolate area noticed an abandoned car and immediately called the police. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they saw that the car's windows and doors were smashed, as if someone had tried to escape from the inside. At first, it seemed that no one was inside, but they were alerted by the smell of decay coming from the trunk. Upon opening it, they discovered the body of a 71-year-old psychiatrist from California, Tom Burchard. Tom was a well-known and respected person who had dedicated his entire life to helping others. His patients adored him for his kindness and compassion, and his colleagues respected him for his professionalism. Unfortunately, Tom had no children of his own, although he was married. Perhaps that's why he immersed himself in work with troubled children and teenagers, trying to fill the void in his heart. In addition to psychiatry, Tom had another passion: magic. He was a member of the exclusive magicians club, the Magic Castle, and often entertained his young patients with tricks. He especially enjoyed turning a $1 bill into a $100 bill. This trick invariably caused delight and joy in children. If Tom found out that one of his patients' parents was having financial difficulties, he would give them this magic bill without hesitation. Thanks to his generosity and kindness, Tom became a true light in the lives of many disadvantaged children and their families.
How did he end up in the trunk in the middle of the desert, hundreds of miles from home? I'll tell you all the details right now. Burchard's patients were many women who found themselves in difficult life circumstances. Single mothers suffering from drug addiction or forced to sell their bodies to feed their children. Tom sincerely cared about their fates and often offered financial assistance, even though it might have seemed unethical from the point of view of his profession. But one day in December 2000, when Tom was 52, his own life turned upside down. How, of course, upside down because he was Trump's psychologist. Sorry, a bad joke. His wife found out that he was secretly communicating with young girls on the internet, meeting with them and giving them money. She immediately filed for divorce, suspecting her husband of infidelity and sexual relations with his patients. Tom denied any illegal actions and insisted that he was guided solely by the desire to help women in need. However, his reputation was tarnished, and his motives were incomprehensible to those around him. It seemed that at this point, Dr. Burchard's personal life had finally collapsed. But during a vacation in Las Vegas in 22, he met Judy, a 42-year-old divorced mother of 4. Despite the age difference, they quickly found common ground. Both did not drink alcohol, spent time by the pool, went to concerts, and even promised each other to meet again. Soon, Judy moved in with Tom in the small town of Salinas. They lived together in a cozy country house, and it seemed that the doctor had finally found his happiness. Judy's children became a real family for him, which he had never had. In 2017, Dr. Burchard's wife took another unexpected turn. Through the internet, he met 24-year-old Kelsey Turner, a young and ambitious girl with a difficult fate. Kelsey was born on May 5, 1993 in Norfolk, Virginia. At the age of 22, she decided to radically change her life and moved to sunny California with the dream of becoming a successful model. On social media, the girl created the image of a bad Barbie, a sexy and daring beauty who is not afraid to break the rules. It seemed that fate itself smiled upon Kelsey. She began posing for such famous men's magazines as Playboy and Maxim. Once, some of her photos from those days fell into my hands. I must admit, the girl was really stunning. A slender figure, lush white curls, a magnetic gaze. Men love such women. But as is often the case, a completely different reality was hidden behind the glossy cover. It turned out that despite her popularity on the internet, and Kelsey had over 100,000 subscribers, her modeling career never took off, and she already had 2 children from different men, a boy and a girl. The first pregnancy occurred when Kelsey was only 17, but the boy who was the child's father quickly disappeared from her life immediately after the birth of her daughter. In 2014, Turner made another attempt to establish her personal life. She got married and gave birth to a son. But this marriage also broke up very quickly, leaving Kelsey a single mother with 2 children in her arms and a lot of debts. And so, yesterday she was a star of the network, and today she is a destitute, homeless woman who barely makes ends meet. It was probably at this moment of despair that she met Dr. Burchard. Having learned about Kelsey's difficult circumstances, Thomas offered to rent an apartment for her and the children for $3,000 a month. He not only paid the deposit, but also paid for housing for a whole year and gave money for daily expenses. And all this was from his own pocket, without demanding anything in return. Of course, such a gesture can be assessed in different ways. Some will see it as a manifestation of sincere mercy, others as another proof of the doctor's strange inclinations in relations with young women. But from the point of view of the investigation, the fact itself is important. A 71-year-old respected psychiatrist suddenly decided to sponsor the life of a failed model and her 2 children. Why? And wasn't it part of some kind of intricate manipulation on Kelsey's part? As it turned out later, Kelsey was far from the only young woman patronized by 71-year-old Dr. Burchard. There were a good dozen of them, and they all gladly took advantage of the generosity of the elderly psychiatrist. But it seems that even among them, Kelsey stood out with her special appetites. No one else demanded such exorbitant sums from Tom. Judy, of course, knew about her husband's charitable impulses, and he himself did not hide it. However, Tom's relationship with Kelsey was becoming increasingly tense. Despite the crazy money he gave her supposedly for the maintenance of children, the girl's appetites grew incessantly. On social networks, she flaunted photos from noisy parties in the company of friends and did not even think about changing her lifestyle. Judy finally came to her senses. Kelsey was shamelessly exploiting Tom's kindness, manipulating his feelings. She begged her husband to stop sponsoring the girl, but he had already managed to throw $300,000 down the drain. Every week, Kelsey received money from him for renting a home, refueling a car, and her own whims. and all these expenses instantly turned into drinking and partying. Even a saint would lose patience here. But for some reason, Tom also needed pressure from Judy to finally come to his senses and stop paying for Kelsey's dissolute life. He warned the landlord that he would give the money only for the next 3 months, and then let the girl manage on her own. Of course, Kelsey did not like this. She suddenly lost her main breadwinner. Her fury fell not only on Tom, but also on that bitch Judy, who, oh horror, dared to open her husband's eyes. In messages, the girl promised to kill her rival and included her in the blacklist. Feeling that Tom was moving away, Kelsey resorted to outright blackmail. She threatened to call the police and say that he was a pedophile, thereby ruining his career and reputation. A person frightened by scandal is easy prey for manipulators. Tom was afraid of gossip and condemnation, but luckily Judy was there to support him in the difficult moment. I must admit that even I, a seasoned cop, got the creeps from this story.
It's hard to believe that a young girl can be so insidious and merciless, and all for the sake of easy money. After Thomas stopped paying the rent for Kelsey's apartment, she was evicted in November 2018. It would seem that their relationship should have ended there, but not at all. The girl continued to terrorize the elderly doctor with threats, and in the end, he agreed to give her money for the last time just to get rid of her forever. Kelsey told Tom a sad story that social services had taken away her daughter, and now she wants to leave the city. In December 2018, she moved to Las Vegas, Nevada. At that time, Thomas decided to stop all communication with her. But Kelsey herself did not waste time. Barely arriving in Vegas, she met some Greg, and right after Christmas, they started living together. However, the relationship of this couple was, to put it mildly, turbulent. The police visited their home several times because of domestic violence, and Greg was even arrested. But Kelsey did not grieve alone for long. Already in February 2019, she found herself a new boyfriend, John Logan Kenninson, an extremely dubious personality. He had just been released from prison, where he was serving a sentence for drug distribution, and immediately occupied Kelsey's home. And then Dr. Burchard, who was in Vegas at a medical conference at the time, behaved extremely strangely. Despite all of Kelsey's previous threats, he met with her. Excuse me, I can't help but add, but don't all Trump supporters always want to go back to the way things used to be? A coincidence? I don't think so. It seems that the elderly man simply could not erase the girl from his life. Upon returning to California, he began to help her again, this time with money. And all because Kelsey wrote to him that her new roommate was beating her and begged for help for herself and her son. Thomas, of course, became seriously alarmed. But he decided not to tell Judy the truth. He lied that he was going to some magic show. On March 1, 2019, he flew to Las Vegas to see with his own eyes what was happening to Kelsey. It turned out that the girl lives in the house not only with her son and a sadist roommate. They also had a tenant, a certain Diana Pena, a 30-year-old waitress. She lived for free in exchange for babysitting Kelsey's son. In addition to this strange company, a not-quite-sewn-on guy named Jeremy also lived in the house. He occupied a room on the first floor. And so Kelsey introduces Dr. Burchard to all these people, supposedly her good acquaintance, almost a benefactor who is in love with her. Of course, such an explanation caused surprise and bewilderment among the roommates. But Kelsey herself vehemently denied any romantic connection. They say the man is just incredibly generous. That's why he helps. And it seemed that everything was fine. But on the very first night of Thomas's stay in the house, an unfortunate surprise happened. Jeremy's girlfriend appeared on the doorstep, blonde, drunk, and obviously not averse to flirting with a wealthy guest. And he, why sin to conceal, was partial to young beauties. Kelsey terribly disliked this. Apparently, she was afraid that a random rival would take away her sponsor. And without an influx of fresh dollars, Kelsey's usual way of life with drinking and partying was under threat. That evening, Thomas and Jeremy's girlfriend decided to go to the store. Dr. Burchard got behind the wheel as he did not drink alcohol. But Kelsey, consumed by jealousy, began to accuse her companion of deliberately creating discord in her relationship with Thomas. Jeremy seemed to feel the growing tension. Upon returning home, he hastily packed his things and left the house with his girlfriend, apparently so as not to aggravate the situation. Meanwhile, Thomas sent Judy a message. He explained that he came to Kelsey to clarify the situation and find out the truth. He promised to stay for the weekend and return home on March 4th. Judy was seriously worried about her husband. She knew better than anyone what Kelsey was capable of in her cruelty and manipulations. And Thomas, honest and trusting, would hardly be able to stand up for himself. She desperately begged him to return and never meet Kelsey again.
After all, that girl, in Judy's opinion, was a dangerous person in an extremely unstable state. But all persuasion was in vain. Thomas did not listen to his wife. And as it turned out, that message was the last one Judy received from her beloved husband. After that, Thomas stopped communicating, and his phone was turned off altogether. Alarming premonitions did not leave Judy. She knew that her husband was suffering from early dementia, which made the situation even more dramatic. Sometimes Thomas could not find his car in the parking lot or lost things, and sometimes he even forgot the way home or did not recognize Judy's daughter. In addition, Dr. Burchard had a significant amount of cash with him, about $1,000, and also a diary where he wrote down everything he forgot, including passwords. Judy was afraid that her husband could be robbed or that he simply got lost in a strange city. She contacted the police 3 times, sharing her fears and suspicions. She told law enforcement officers that Thomas had gone to Kelsey and even gave them the girl's address. She noted that she had already demonstrated her cruelty more than once and was unlikely to stop using the generosity of her trusting husband. Judy was convinced that something had happened to Tom after all. He did not return when he promised. The police visited Kelsey's house several times, but to no avail. There was no one there. Only during the last visit, they noticed some strange details. The lights were on in the windows, the blinds were open, and the mailbox was completely stuffed with letters. The front door was unlocked. Going inside, the cops found no one. Only the pungent smell of cleaning products wafting through the air seemed extremely suspicious to them. Deciding not to touch potential evidence, law enforcement officers left the house. Having contacted the owner of the dwelling, the police found out little. The man only confirmed the fact that someone had paid for 3 months' rent in advance, and that neither Kelsey nor Thomas were at home. Well, in light of these circumstances, the cops simply had no other choice. They obtained a search warrant for Kelsey's home, hoping to find at least some clues in this confusing story. On the morning of March 7, 2019 at 10:50 a.m., an event occurred that became a turning point in this tangled story. Some men with children were driving along a deserted road in the Nevada desert. Suddenly, they noticed a Mercedes parked in a strange place. But it was not this that caught their attention, but the broken window of the car. Without hesitation, the concerned citizens called the police. When the patrol arrived at the scene, the cops thoroughly examined the vehicle. The windows and doors were damaged as if someone had forcibly tried to get out from the inside. After starting the engine and opening the trunk, the police saw some items. But what alarmed them the most was the smell of decay emanating from there. Under the blanket lay a mutilated male body with signs of brutal violence. In my years, I've seen plenty of horrific scenes at crime scenes, but what they did to this poor soul shocked even me, a seasoned cop. The forensic experts who arrived soon began to carefully study the car. Inside, latex gloves and cleaning supplies were found. Someone was clearly trying to remove evidence. Blood traces were also found on the driver's seat, although it was not easy to establish what exactly happened there. However, the overall picture was quite obvious. It seemed that the victim was attacked right in the car, and then, barely alive or already dead, was shoved into the trunk. The examination showed that the poor man was beaten to death, having received numerous blows to the head with a blunt object. In addition, numerous bruises, cuts, and scratches were found on the body. A particularly eerie detail was the missing part of the ear. Judging by the wounds on his hands, the man had desperately tried to defend himself. But in vain, a series of powerful blows to the head left him no chance. The first thing the police found out was the name of the car owner. It turned out to be none other than Kelsey Turner. The cops immediately linked the disappearance of Dr. Burchard with the found mutilated body. Having obtained a warrant, the investigators visited Kelsey's home with a search. Already on the spot, they found telling evidence. A bloody towel, identical to the one lying in the trunk of a Mercedes, traces of blood on broken doors, and most interestingly, cleaning supplies. It seemed as if someone had desperately tried to wipe the bloody stains off the floor. On March 15, the police finally received permission to arrest the main suspect. 2 weeks later, Kelsey Turner, who was hiding with her son in California at the time, was detained by FBI agents. The boy was sent to the care of a foster family, and the negligent mother was officially charged with murder. Her last roommate, John, was also taken into custody. It seemed that everything was clear, only the details remained. However, a real breakthrough in the investigation was the testimony of Diana, a neighbor and an involuntary participant in those terrible events. The woman herself came to the police along with her lawyer. In exchange for a mitigation of punishment, she told the investigators in detail everything that actually happened that fateful evening. I must admit, after hearing her testimony, even I, an old detective, was stunned by the ruthlessness and cold-bloodedness of the criminals. The second day of Dr. Burchard's visit to Kelsey in Vegas turned out to be fatal. Diana, as usual, was working at a local bar. Thomas and Kelsey came to pick her up after her shift. The doctor was driving, but he obviously had a poor sense of direction in the city and quickly got lost. Losing patience, Kelsey snatched his phone under the pretext of searching for a route. But having the device in her hands, she couldn't resist and began rummaging through Tom's messenger. And here she made an extremely unpleasant discovery. Among the messages were nude photos of her own mother, Samantha. Digging further, Kelsey found out shocking details. It turned out that her mother was also begging for money from the elderly psychiatrist. She must have touched him with some moving story from her difficult life, and the kind-hearted doctor, of course, fell for it. Upon learning about this, Kelsey went mad with rage. A barrage of insults and reproaches fell upon Thomas. The poor man was confused and did not know how to react to her frenzied attack. By some miracle, he still managed to get the car to the house without getting into an accident. But the adventures did not end there. At home, Kelsey continued to yell at Tom, calling him names. She threatened to expose his connection with her mother and ruin his reputation. To somehow hide from this verbal pressure, Thomas locked himself in her son's room. Fortunately, the boy was not at home that evening. He was staying overnight at a friend's place. However, Kelsey did not calm down. Now she was already demanding that Thomas pay a huge sum for her silence. The doctor could not stand it and slammed the door in anger. This sound infuriated John, who had been silently watching everything that was happening. Grabbing a baseball bat, he smashed the door of the room with a swing. Diana saw John rushing down the corridor like a mad beast. Then there was a dull thud, and a moment later she saw Thomas's body lying on the floor. A huge bruise was already swelling on his head. Puzzled by their own deed, John and Kelsey instantly fled, leaving the unconscious doctor to his fate. Diana rushed to help the poor man. She gave him water, tried to somehow bring him to his senses. Thomas barely realized what had happened. He was in deep shock. Diana understood that the man needed immediate medical attention. She wanted to take him to the hospital, but unfortunately, she did not know how to drive a car. Thomas was also unable to get behind the wheel. We had to wait for Kelsey and John. There was simply no one else to count on. But the couple was in no hurry to rescue their victim. On the contrary, the exhausted Thomas whispered a terrible thing to Diana. Most likely, these two were planning to kill him. A moment later, Kelsey returned. Cynically stating that she would take Tom to the hospital, she began hastily wiping away all traces of the attack. The frightened Diana rushed to wash the bloodied floor. At the same time, she heard Thomas desperately arguing with his tormentors in the garage. And then, through the noise, Kelsey's cold order to John reached her. "Hit him again." The girl rushed downstairs to stop the beast of a roommate. But alas, she did not make it in time. An innocent person was being brutally finished off right before her eyes, and no one was going to save the victim. Diana was in complete shock from what she saw. She froze in place, not knowing what to do next. Tears streamed down her face, but Kelsey did not give the girl even a minute to despair. Coldly ordering the subordinate to go back upstairs and erase the last traces of the crime, she herself began to carry the bloody body out of the house. Meanwhile, the police, called by one of the neighbors, were already banging on the door. Diana had every chance to stop this madness. It was enough just to open the door and tell the cops the truth. But the girl did not dare. She panicked and barricaded herself inside, hoping to wait out the danger. The next day, Kelsey took Thomas's mutilated body to the desert and left it in the trunk of his own car. Perhaps she hoped that in such a deserted place, exposure could be avoided, but she miscalculated. On March 21, Kelsey and her roommate John were finally arrested on suspicion of murder. The obstinate couple denied their involvement to the last, blaming each other. And here Diana's testimony played a key role. Thanks to a plea deal with the investigation, the girl was released on bail. Already in court, she fearlessly pointed to Kelsey and John as the direct killers of Thomas. The defenders of the defendants, of course, tried to tarnish the witness and downplay the significance of her testimony, but in vain. During the hearings, Kelsey always appeared in loose prison clothes, and no wonder she was in the last months of pregnancy with another, already third child. Who was the father of this baby remained a mystery. In the end, John surrendered first. He confessed to second-degree murder, admitting his part in the conspiracy. The court sentenced him to 45 years behind bars. Kelsey held out to the last, pretending to be an innocent victim of circumstances. Her own trial was scheduled for November 2022, but a moment before the start of the hearing, the woman suddenly changed her testimony. She also admitted guilt in second-degree murder. The sentence is 25 years in prison. Already in the cell, Kelsey gave birth to a daughter who was instantly transferred to the guardianship authorities. It seems that the child was lucky she will not see her insidious mother until she becomes an adult, and let that one rot behind bars. The investigation established that Kelsey was a clever swindler and a pathological liar. She cynically used the kind-hearted Thomas for money, and when she realized that the elderly doctor would no longer be her source of income, she decided to get rid of him. Kelsey's accusations of pedophilia against Dr. Burchard turned out to be completely unfounded. The police thoroughly examined the contents of his phone and other electronic devices, but did not find any evidence to support these horrific allegations. Yes, there were photos of naked women in his mobile phone's memory, but there were no images of children or minors among them. The investigators also unearthed the fact of intimate correspondence between Thomas and Kelsey with quite explicit photos. But since both were adults, these materials were considered inappropriate to be presented in court as evidence of the doctor's guilt. It is difficult to unequivocally assess the actions of Dr. Burchard. On the one hand, his relationships with young women and obsession with charity seem strange, to say the least, especially for a respectable man well over 70. But despite everything, Thomas was a kind, sensitive person who sincerely sought to help those in need, and his professional merits and good reputation are undeniable. Until the very end, his wife Judy tried to protect the trusting Thomas from Kelsey's insidious encroachments. She repeatedly begged her husband to sever all ties with this girl. She felt that she was manipulating and using the elderly doctor for her own selfish purposes. Unfortunately, the man in love completely lost his mind and did not listen to her wise advice. And now I would like to draw your attention to another tragic aspect of this eerie story. To the fate of Kelsey's unfortunate children, a boy and 2 girls, whom she gave birth to from different men. Babies who were unlucky enough to be born to this irresponsible and cynical woman. She always put her own desires and whims above the needs and well-being of her offspring.
Thanks to Diana's testimony, it became known that Kelsey used children as a lever of influence on others. She asked for money allegedly for their maintenance, but she spent it on entertainment and drugs. She led a dissolute life, dragging the kids through dubious rented apartments and dens. Are these normal conditions for the growth and development of children? It's strange that social services did not take them away earlier. I'm afraid to imagine what traumas such upbringing will turn into for these kids. After all, they never had a chance to experience maternal warmth and genuine care. Their short life is continuous poverty, instability, and arbitrariness of an insidious mother. And the worst thing is that Kelsey's care was cut short in the most insidious way through the brutal murder of a person. Not the best example to follow. You know, such high-profile cases always make you wonder what is going on in the heads of such Kelseys. What pushes these young women to embark on a bloody path and drag the innocent with them? One thing I can say for sure, at the heart of their actions lies vile selfishness and the inability to take responsibility for their lives. They are not ready to be mothers, but they give birth to children. They do not want to work, but they strive for luxury and wealth. They manipulate, lie, and parasitize on the kindness of others. And when the victim shows character, they get rid of them at any cost. Thinking about Kelsey Turner, I can't get rid of the feeling of bitterness and disappointment. This woman is a prime example of what a mother should not be. She completely forgot about her most important duty to take care of the well-being and safety of her own children. Instead of creating a stable and loving environment for them, Kelsey turned the lives of her offspring into complete chaos. She dragged them through various boyfriends and dubious dwellings, while she herself was drinking and using drugs at this time. The kids lived in an atmosphere of constant fear, neglect, and deprivation. But even this did not prompt the negligent mother to come to her senses and change her behavior. She continued to make irresponsible decisions, obeying only her own impulsive desires. And she used the children as a lever for pressure and manipulation of others, including Dr. Burchard. Tragically, in the end, even Judy could not protect the poor kids from the devastating influence of their mother. Social services also lacked the determination to take them out of the toxic environment. One can only imagine what traumas and complexes such upbringing inflicted on them for life. In this bloody drama, Dr. Thomas Burchard found himself a hostage to his own good intentions. Despite some controversial traits of his personality, he was a kind and sensitive person who sincerely sought to help those in need. He did not deserve such a cruel and untimely death at the hands of an insidious fraudster whom he unreservedly trusted.
This case has become a chilling confirmation of the old truth. Sometimes excessive kindness, generosity, and trust turn against the benefactor himself. Not everyone who reaches out for help is guided by pure thoughts. Some, like Kelsey, only need money and the opportunity to parasitize on other people's resources.
Of course, it's easy to judge the victim from the height of lived years and one's own experience, like it was necessary to think with your head, not your heart. Do not succumb to the manipulation and threats of a scammer. But Thomas, it seems, simply could not do otherwise. His humanity, sincerity, and compassion for the disadvantaged became both his greatest virtue and his fatal mistake. Now we can only hope that Kelsey's orphan children will find comfort in a new loving family. That some kind people will take them under their wing and give them the peace, comfort, and care that these babies have been deprived of since birth. Perhaps this will somewhat compensate them for the traumatic past and help them grow into worthy individuals. As for Dr. Thomas Burchard, he will undoubtedly remain forever in the memory of those he managed to help during his lifetime. His bright soul, selflessness, and desire to give good will definitely not be forgotten. And although these amazing qualities eventually ruined Thomas, they also turned him into a real guardian angel for many unfortunate and disadvantaged people. They say that true kindness does not need gratitude or recognition. It does not expect anything in return, but simply does the right thing at the call of the heart. Probably this is exactly what our deceased doctor was, a generous soul in a soulless world of human cruelty and self-interest. And although his earthly path ended too early and tragically, I want to believe that there, in the afterlife, Thomas finally found the peace and love that he sometimes lacked during his lifetime. And we, the cops, will just do our job. We will punish the guilty so that the death of this bright man is not in vain. It's hard to put an end to such high-profile cases, because despite the arrests and trials, some bitter injustice remains, as if evil once again prevailed, and we again could not prevent a bloody denouement. But despite everything, I believe that every good deed, every rescue, and every punished abomination makes this world at least a little better and safer. And even if we are not given to eradicate all the evil, at least we do not allow it to prevail completely. The story of Dr. Burchard will become another sad, but important brick in the wall of human memory. A warning for some and an inspiration for others. A reminder that evil is always near, but good does not disappear either. The main thing is not to lose humanity and compassion, even in the face of the most terrible trials. In the morning of August 15th, 1989, Wolfgang Silaf received a phone call in his office. Mom has disappeared. He heard through the tears in the voice of Yasmin, the 20-year-old daughter of his younger sister Birgit Meyer, who was 41 at the time. Wolfgang immediately understood that his sister couldn't have simply vanished and abandoned her daughter. Despite the fact that the girl was no longer a child, they had maintained a very close and trusting relationship with her mother. In 1989, Wolfgang was leading the criminal police department in Hamburg, however. Even such an influential person couldn't secure a thorough investigation into his sister's disappearance by the police in the city of Lüneburg, where Birgit lived. Firstly, the Lüneburg police were occupied with the investigation of 2 murders, to which they devoted all their resources. Secondly, apart from their workload, there was another reason to approach this case somewhat carelessly. They had a suspect from the very beginning, Birgit's husband Harold Meyer. The man was a successful businessman working in the printing industry. He had started dating another woman after separating from his wife a few months before Birgit's disappearance. Birgit, who was unemployed at the time of their separation, struggled with the impending divorce and occasionally sought solace in alcohol. However, on the evening of August 14th, 1989, Birgit greeted her husband with a smile. Harold came to discuss the terms of their separation, and it seemed that the woman had finally come to terms with her emotions. Birgit and Harold had a friendly discussion about the conditions of their divorce. Birgit was supposed to receive 500,000 Deutsche Marks and agreed to move out of the family home near Lüneburg. The next day, they had agreed to go to a notary. However, in the morning, Yasmin discovered her mother's disappearance. Birgit's Opel Cabriolet was parked in the garage, but there was no sign of the woman anywhere in the house. As it would later become known, her documents had also disappeared. Apart from a shoe print near Birgit's house, there were no slightest indications of a committed crime, no blood, no signs of struggle. According to Birgit's husband, the previous evening had gone smoothly and they hadn't argued. After her husband left,
Birgit had spoken on the phone with her mother and daughter and had mentioned that she and her husband didn't quarrel and that the meeting went well. However, despite Harold's statements, the police suspected that the husband had found another way to part with his wife and avoid paying her $500,000. Today, Harold Meyer continues to live in the same house from which his wife disappeared without a trace. He remembers Birgit as always being his loyal friend whom he could fully rely on. However, many believe Harold was guilty of his wife's disappearance and later her murder. He heard constant whispers and rumors. His friends questioned whether he had taken Birgit in his Porsche and dumped her into the sea from his motorboat. Even his own daughter sometimes had a silent question in her eyes, wondering if he knew something about her mother's whereabouts, and if the police could be right in their suspicions. Only Wolfgang Zilaf believed that Harold had nothing to do with his sister's disappearance because Harold and Birgit never argued about money. When Birgit met Harold leaving 32 years ago, elegantly dressed, he immediately noticed that she had had a few drinks to lift her spirits. He teased her, saying that she probably didn't plan on getting bored, and she flirtatiously replied, "Who knows?" Now he believes that her killer was nearby at that moment, already waiting for the opportune moment to attack her. However, it was only 6 weeks after Birgit's disappearance that Harold began to have suspicions about what might have happened that day. A colleague of his wife told him that on the day of Birgit's disappearance, she had cheerfully mentioned the neighbor's gardener in a conversation. Allegedly, he had knocked on Birgit's door, introduced himself, and asked for directions to a certain house, even though he already knew the address. Harold didn't know what to think. He remembered a party in the neighboring house where the gardener was also present. A quiet and silent man, blond with very beautiful features but a terrifying gaze. Harold recalled how he had been extremely frightened by the cold and evaluative look in his icy eyes. And now it turned out that Birgit had met him a few months before her disappearance, right after that party at the neighbor's. She had been drinking excessively, and the gardener had escorted her home. Harold reported this new acquaintance of his wife to the police. The investigators found out that the gardener, who also worked at the cemetery, was named Kurt Werner Wichmann. He was handsome but an extremely dangerous type. In his early years, he had threatened a young mother and her child with a knife, and in his youth, he abducted a hitchhiking girl, subjected her to abuse, and nearly killed her. After that incident, he spent 5.5 years in prison. Kurt Werner Wichmann, the investigators decided to personally talk to Wichmann and invited him to the police station. He showed up wearing gloves, claiming it was due to allergies. Wichmann stated that he had an alibi during the time of the woman's disappearance. After work, he spent the entire evening at home and only went for a walk with his German Shepherd after 10 p.m., but it didn't take him more than 15 minutes. His words were confirmed by his wife. Wisely, Wichmann decided not to mention that he had been on sick leave on the day of Birgit's disappearance and didn't need to go to work. It wouldn't have been difficult for the police to verify this, but surprisingly, Wichmann didn't seem worthy of attention as a suspect to any of the investigators. Wolfgang noted that at the very least, a preliminary investigation should have been initiated. However, this did not happen. The brother of the missing woman constantly heard from his colleagues that they were doing everything possible but unfortunately couldn't find her. When he tried to gather more information about the case, they fell silent. Days, months, and years passed before a new prosecutor in Lüneburg took up the case. It was only in 1993, 3.5 years after Birgit's disappearance, that a criminal case was filed against Kurt Werner Wichmann on suspicion of Birgit Meyer's murder. On a cold February morning in 1993, the police knocked on the door of a brick house on the outskirts of Lüneburg, Kurt Werner Wichmann's home. His wife opened the door, but her husband was not at home. The police presented a search warrant and began their work. The search immediately led the officers to a recently demolished wall made of plasterboard in the basement. On the first floor, they noticed a soundproof door. Kurt's wife explained that she didn't have a key. It was only in possession of her husband and his brother.
The officers forced open the door, behind which awaited a veritable arsenal, 2 small-caliber rifles, a revolver, silencers, ammunition, stun guns, knives, sedatives, chains, ropes, and handcuffs with traces of blood. The police confiscated all these items. During the search of the surrounding area, a metal detector was triggered. With the help of a police excavator, they managed to dig up something extraordinary in Witchman's garden, an entire car, a brand new bright red Ford sports coupe, on the back seat of which forensic experts found blood. The search team also detected a strong smell of decomposing flesh inside the car, but no actual body was found. Shortly thereafter, the police found a parked VW Golf near Lunenburg registered to Witchman. Inside the car, they discovered road maps, a sleeping bag, a thermos, and binoculars. The equipment seemed more suitable for a hunter or someone who spends a lot of time spying on people they intend to kill. For several weeks, Kurt managed to evade the authorities. However, on April 15, 1993, an accident occurred on a country road near Heilbronn. The police inspected the car, which contained 2 men. Weapons were found in the car, so the driver was taken to the station. It was discovered that the driver was Kurt, and his younger brother was sitting next to him in the car. The police did not believe that Kurt could pose a danger to himself, so they did not confiscate his belt. The man died in his prison cell on April 25, 1993, at the age of 43. The police quickly closed the case because, according to the German Code of Criminal Procedure, the deceased should not become the subject of an investigation. However, this was far from the end of the story. Rather, it was the beginning of an investigation that would lead to the uncovering of the most horrifying crimes in the country's criminal history. In 2002, Wolfgang retired and was able to dedicate more attention and time to his sister's case. He gained access to the case files and was shocked. To his horror, he discovered that all the evidence had been destroyed, including the red Ford that was unearthed, and the basement in Kurt's house, where the search team had sensed the presence of remains, had never been thoroughly investigated. However, in Wolfgang's opinion, the evidence should have been preserved. Firstly, because there is no statute of limitations on murder cases. Secondly, the principle of not conducting an investigation against the dead is not applicable in this case because there is another suspect, Birgit Harold, the husband of Birgit Meyer. To justify or condemn Harold, all the evidence needed to be examined, the neighbors of Kurt needed to be interrogated. In short, regular police work needed to be done. But now, it was impossible to study the evidence. Nevertheless, Wolfgang decided not to give up and assembled a group of volunteers from his former colleagues. They discussed the motives, possible developments, and the behavior of the perpetrator again and again. Finally, they came up with the idea that Birgit's disappearance might be connected to other unsolved crimes. In search of confirmation of this theory, Wolfgang went to Wyman's house. The secret room had hardly changed since it was discovered in 1993. In the room, he found video recordings of 2 TV shows, one about Birgit Meyer's disappearance and the other about the murders in Gould. Wolfgang immediately informed the police in Lunenburg, and nothing happened. The cases remained unsolved for years. In 2015, the head of the criminal police department in Lunenburg was replaced. Wolfgang managed to convince him to create a commission to review his sister's case. The commission was led by an experienced and meticulous specialist, Richard Kaufmann, who had solved all his cases over the past few years. He discovered that a tiny drop of blood was found on the handcuffs found in Wyman's secret room, and the sample had not been destroyed because it was stored at the Hanover Medical School laboratory. DNA comparison showed that the blood belonged to Birgit Meyer. Now, there was no doubt that Wyman had handcuffed Birgit and probably killed her. The investigators speculated that he wanted to kidnap her and demand a ransom from Harold, but something went wrong. It was evident that at least 2 people were involved in the abduction because a neighbor heard the sound of a running car engine that night. Where could Birgit's body have been?
The investigator examined several graves dug in the cemetery when Wyman worked there, but Birgit Meyer was not found in them. Then Wolfgang decided to find out everything he could about the man's past. First of all, one should not imagine a spoiled boy from a wonderful family. His father used to threaten his mother with an axe and was cruel to his sons. Young Kurt Werner Wyman ended up in a social institution called Witch and Stiff, and after the New Year holidays in 1964, he didn't want to go back. But he needed money to escape, so the 14-year-old boy entered the apartment of his parents' tenants, a young family, with a dagger and a flashlight. The husband was at work, and only the mother and the infant were at home. The woman woke up because of the flashlight's light, screamed, and the boy lightly choked her to prevent her from screaming. Then he turned to the child, and the woman was about to believe that he would do something to her son, but fortunately, he changed his mind. Unfortunately, the girl whom 22-year-old Kirk decided to give a ride to in 1970 was not so lucky. Offering a hitchhiking girl to get in his car, he took her to the forest and attacked her. After getting what he wanted, he choked the poor girl a little and threw her in the trunk, apparently planning to bury her. However, something incredible happened. When he opened the trunk again, the girl, who had regained consciousness, managed to convince the man to let her go, pretending that he shouldn't be afraid of her. But when he read an article about the attack in the newspaper 2 days later, he realized that the events described in it were not as he perceived them. And what did he do?
He went to the police to, as he claimed, correct some facts. After adjusting the facts, the man spent 5.5 years in prison. People who knew Kirk describe him as an arrogant loner. He didn't need friends, but he had a strong need for recognition, so he was a braggart from childhood and loved things, especially cars,
that he couldn't afford. Realizing what kind of person Kurt was, Wolfgang understood that he was obsessed with control. He was a narcissist for whom it was important how he appeared in the eyes of others. The desire to control his external image was so great that he was even willing to turn himself in after committing a crime. Therefore, Wolfgang assumed that his sister Birgit Meyer's body was hidden in Wyman's house or on the premises of his house. It's sad that when he asked the police in Lüneburg to conduct a thorough search there a few years ago, they didn't listen to him. As the head of the investigation group told him, his criminal experience told him that Birgit wasn't there. While he was saying this, he was standing right above her body, with only a concrete slab separating them. When Wolfgang finally opened the concrete floor in Kurt's garage many years later, he found what was left of his sister's body. The autopsy showed that Birgit Meyer was shot in the head, just like at least one of the victims of the Horde murders and another victim of the 1968 murder. The Birgit case was solved, but Wolfgang decided not to stop there, remembering other families waiting for the crimes that affected their loved ones to be solved. Thus, thanks to Wolfgang's persistence, a crime that had terrified the entire northern part of Germany in the 90s was finally solved at the end of 2017. The murders in Gord. Gord is the vast wooded area east of Lüneburg. In July 1989, the weather in northern Germany was sunny and hot, prompting many people to seek refuge from the summer heat in the cool shade of the forest. On July 12, 1989, 2 days before Birgit's disappearance, 3 people who were picking blueberries in Gord suddenly smelled a nauseating sweet odor. Trying to find the source of the smell, they discovered a human hand under a pine tree among the branches. It turned out that on May 21, 1989, a married couple from Hamburg, 51-year-old Peter and 45-year-old Ursula Reinhold, went on a picnic in the forest, intending to spend a pleasant time in the fresh air. They were brutally murdered, and their bodies were dragged away from the scene of the attack. When they were discovered, the husband and wife were almost naked, but it was unclear whether the perpetrator had undressed them or if they had undressed themselves before the attack. The killer took their picnic basket, binoculars, and the keys to their car, which he used to escape. The car was later found in another city. The disappearance of the couple was reported, but they could not be found for 7 weeks. Due to the heat, very little remained of their bodies, making it impossible to determine the cause of death. However, robbery was ruled out as the motive because valuable items were still found on the victims. Since there were no mobile phones at the time, the people picking berries hurried to the forest ranger to inform him of the horrifying discovery so that he could report it to the police. However, it was not just the bodies themselves that terrified the Germans, who nicknamed Gord the Dead Forest. The unique fact in modern criminal history in Germany was that while the police were still examining Peter and Ursula's bodies, the killer claimed the lives of another couple located just 800 meters away from the investigators. On July 12, 1989, Ingrid Warmbier, 46, and Bernd Michael Kopping, 43, from Hanover, arrived in Gord. They were spouses but not with each other, which is why they chose this forest. After parking their car, they walked about 2 kilometers into the forest. They were brutally killed, sound of a gunshot, and then the killer took their Polaroid camera and the keys to their car, with which he fled. It was later determined that he drove the car for about a week before abandoning it. The bodies were discovered by chance only 2 weeks later when the police were searching the area due to the first 2 murders. The crime scenes were only 800 meters apart, but subsequent tests showed that the police working on the first murder could not hear the gunshots due to the locations of the crime scenes in the depressions. Given the new discovery, the random encounter of the berry pickers became of great importance. As they hurried to the forest ranger to report the horrifying find, they encountered a man. Of course, 2 weeks later, their description of the person would be quite vague. But they remembered that they had encountered a tall and strong 40-year-old brunette with medium-length hair, without glasses or a beard. He was carrying a bag that was clearly not empty. Based on the witnesses' accounts, a composite sketch was created even if this man might not have had any connection to the crime. The common factor in these murders was that they were committed in the same area of a vast forest. Additionally, the victims were both of middle age. In 2 cases, the perpetrator stole the victim's belongings, although it was not a typical robbery. He would leave the crime scenes in the victims' cars and then abandon the vehicles in small towns with railway connections. Both towns were located along the Hanover-Hamburg route, and these parallels led investigators to speculate that the same person was responsible for the crimes. In 1989, Kurt Werner Weimann was 40 years old and lived 30 kilometers away from Gord. On the day of the secret lover's murder, he was on sick leave. The spouses were also killed on a Sunday when Kurt didn't have to go to work. However, the investigators initially found no evidence linking Weimann to the crimes in Gord. Furthermore, he did not resemble the composite sketch. Therefore, the police focused on other suspects, suspecting that the deceived husband of the second victim had hired a professional to deal with his unfaithful wife and her lover but accidentally targeted the wrong person before carrying out the hit. Once again, Wolfgang couldn't understand the investigators' decision. He and his group of colleagues immediately suspected that Kurt matched the profile of the Gord killer. The brutality of the crimes and the intimate aspects, as evidenced by the victim's exposed clothing, all aligned with Weimann's profile. Moreover, years ago, Wolfgang found a videotape of the TV program Aktenzeichen Sei, which covered the Gord murders, in Kurt's secret room. Being a narcissist, Kurt also collected video recordings and newspaper clippings about Berdit Meyer. There were also pieces of evidence showing that the man sought information about Bernd Michael Kopping, who was killed in Gord. However, as often happens today, the DNA analysis provided the final piece of evidence. The Gord killer had a habit of driving the victims' cars for several days. In one of the vehicles, 3 hairs and possibly other biological materials were found. However, it took nearly 30 years before the DNA in the car was compared to Kurt's DNA. Only at the end of 2017 did the analysis yield a match. Kurt Werner Weimann was the perpetrator of the 2 murders in Gord. November 4, 1989. A quiet night in the fashionable district of Daytona Beach, Florida. Only the lights on the porch illuminate the extravagant mansions, whose occupants have long gone to sleep. Suddenly, the silence of the night was shattered by police sirens after a desperate call was received at the rescue service at 4:54 from the Fopoulous family's house. In the bedroom on the second floor, officers found a man holding his wounded wife to his chest. Another man lay motionless in a pool of blood on the floor. Members of the small but influential Greek community in the city, Costa and Lisa Fopoulous, along with Lisa's mother and brother, lived in a huge white mansion on the banks of the Halifax River. The officers were met by Lisa's brother, who led them to the bedroom on the second floor. 26-year-old Lisa Fopoulous was alive but in agony. She had been shot, and the bullet had entered her head, although hope was not yet lost as it had not penetrated her brain. It struck her forehead, deflected off a bone, and came to a rest just above her left eye. While it was still a gunshot wound, and the medics couldn't know the extent of the damage until she was examined at the hospital, they believed she had a chance to survive. They rushed her to the hospital as quickly as possible. As for the young man lying on the floor, there was nothing that could be done for him. Costa had shot the intruder who attacked his wife, emptying the entire magazine into him. While Lisa was being rushed to the hospital and newspapers competed to write about the hero who shot the robber, saving his wife and family, the police began investigating the botched robbery. However, it didn't take long for suspicions to arise among the investigators. On the first floor of the house, they found a broken window, indicating the intruder had entered through it. But the window was too small for a sturdy man to fit through without cutting himself. It was also too far from the door handle to open it in such a manner. Furthermore, despite the presence of crystal, silverware, electronics, and artwork in the house, the stranger hadn't touched anything and went straight to the bedroom where he shot Lisa. This raises the question of why her instead of first eliminating the main threat, the husband. Even before morning arrived, the investigators decided to take a closer look at this case and at Lisa's husband. Konstantinos or Costa Fopoulous grew up in Athens, Greece, in a wonderful family. His father held a prominent position as one of the directors of the Greek airline. Since childhood, Costa dreamed of moving to the United States, where he believed a better life awaited him, a life filled with sports cars, big houses, and beautiful women. At the age of 18, he enrolled in Daytona University, where he studied aviation management. To cover his expenses, he worked as a waiter in a restaurant. It was there that he was introduced to Lisa. Even in the modern world, traditional values still hold importance, and every Greek family in the USA wants to marry their child to someone from Greece, a person with the same faith and cultural heritage. Costa seemed to be the ambitious and intelligent Greek guy that parents wanted to see as Lisa's husband. The young woman was captivated by the charm of this young man. He too was impressed, but not by her beauty or intelligence, but by the state of her family. Within a few months, the couple became engaged, followed by a joyous Greek wedding. Costa and Lisa appeared to be an ideal couple. After a few years, Lisa's father passed away, leaving her and her brother in charge of the family business, a theme park and several souvenir shops. Costa worked for her mother, and her brother for $300 a week. It was a decent amount for those times, but not a fortune. Soon, Costa decided to start his own business, something he could fully control. The man took money from his wife and opened a billiard club. For a long time, Lisa had no idea how things were going at the bar and that her husband preferred to hire young kids who, for various reasons, ended up on the streets. Costa surrounded himself with teenagers who were unable to say no to him. He enjoyed portraying himself as a powerful, successful man and would tell the young people that he worked for the CIA, carrying out various government missions. And if any of the kids had doubts about the truthfulness of Costa's words, he had evidence. Framed and hanging on the office wall was a letter from the CIA addressed to Costa. However, if someone bothered to read the letter, they would discover that it was simply a job rejection. Fortunately for Costa, the teenagers believed him unquestioningly, and for them, It was 100% proof that their boss was a secret agent. Things reached a point where Costa invited his business partner, Tony Calderoni, on one of his nocturnal outings. Tony, who didn't believe his friend's tall tales, decided to join him out of curiosity. As a result, he watched with suspicion as Costa, dressed head to toe in camouflage, buried a bag with weapons and money in the woods. The bar trapped Costa in a debt hole. He already owed $20,000, but still continued to enjoy life, playing the role of a super agent. Then, on a beautiful day in 1989, his life became even better after meeting the luxurious 20-year-old Deidre Hunt, who entered his establishment in search of work. Costa was captivated by the beauty of the girl, and soon a romance ensued between them. They didn't care about the 10-year age difference or the fact that Costa was married. Deidre turned out to be the complete opposite of Lisa. Lisa was a true lady, while Deidre was a forbidden fruit, full of passion and desire, something that Costa wasn't getting at home. In turn, he became a source of admiration and expensive gifts for her, providing everything she was lacking in life. Deidre grew up in poverty. She didn't know her father, and her mother suffered from several mental disorders, including multiple personalities, specifically 11 different personalities. The girl never knew what awaited her at home when she returned from school, whether her mother would beat her or shower her with affection. And she had no choice because it was her mother. When Deidre was 7 years old, a neighbor began to harass her, abusing her when she was 11 and he was 31. Instead of support, she only received indifference from her mother. The woman didn't work, spending all the money on alcohol. The situation was worsened by the fact that Deidre had to wear orthopedic braces on her legs to walk properly, and her classmates, sensing Deidre's vulnerability, bullied the ugly duckling. However, everything changed after a few years. She no longer needed the braces, and the girl transformed into a beauty, dark hair, dark eyes, and an attractive figure. She began to receive a lot of attention from men. For Deidre, who had never heard a kind word at her address, it was a kind of drug. She indulged in it fully. At the age of 18, she got involved with a bad crowd and was arrested for armed robbery. After her release, the girl decided to start afresh, and in September 1989, she set off to Daytona Beach, where she could get lost among many street youths. But Deidre didn't get lost. She had charisma and beauty. She quickly became one of the highlights of the bar, strolling around in a black bikini and captivating the regulars. Deidre's difficult childhood and arrest didn't deter Costa. On the contrary, he saw in her a vulnerable girl whom he could manipulate, just like other teenagers hanging out in the bar. Costa rented an apartment for Deidre 2 blocks away from her work so they could meet at any time. And out of habit, he fed the naive girl stories about his work for the CIA and how he had killed 8 people and so on. Of course, Lisa quickly discovered that her husband was seeing the waitress. She followed him to the rented apartment, confirmed the truth, and demanded that he end the affair. However, he stubbornly denied everything. Then the proud Greek woman threatened to divorce him. Costa couldn't allow that because in the case of a divorce, he would not only be left penniless but also burdened with debts. Interestingly, this conversation took place just a few weeks before an unknown person attempted a nighttime visit to their home. Costa told the police that on the evening of November 4th, he and his wife were watching movies late into the night before going to sleep. The next thing he remembered was waking up to a deafening sound. Opening his eyes, he saw the silhouette of an armed man looming over his wife. Almost instinctively, he grabbed the weapon he kept for self-defense, rolled onto the floor, and emptied the entire magazine at the intruder. Miraculously, the bullet had narrowly missed Lisa's brain, and she not only quickly regained consciousness but also was able to speak. She confirmed her husband's account of them going to bed late and waking up in pain when he was talking on the phone with emergency services. However, Lisa added a few other interesting details. She saw her husband burying a black sports bag in the backyard earlier that evening for some unknown reason. Furthermore, She recounted an incident that had occurred at her workplace just a week ago when someone had tried to rob her. A young man held a weapon to her and attempted to force her into a small office space. She managed to fall to the floor and crawl between his legs, escaping from him. Fortunately, he didn't pursue her. As detectives listened to her account, they couldn't shake the thought that it might have been an attempt on Lisa Fopoulous' life, incident number 1. So, who was the unfortunate intruder who broke into their home? It turned out to be an 18-year-old named Brian L. Chase. His father stated that his son had been missing for a while, getting involved with a bad crowd that frequented Costa Fopoulous Bar. As the media buzzed about the incident, the news reached the teenagers who frequented Co-Star's bar. A phone call came into the police, altering the course of the investigation. The call was from a 20-year-old named Newman Taylor. Taylor believed that the police would find it interesting to know that if Brian Chase was the one who died, he had been hired to kill the woman. Taylor was a friend of Deirdre, and a few weeks ago, she offered him $10,000 to kill Lisa. It was a tempting offer, but what stopped him was his knowledge of Costa. Taylor was certain that he wouldn't make it out of the Fopoulous house alive because Costa had an arsenal of weapons stored there. He refused, realizing that his own death could be part of the plan. Now, when he read the news, he immediately understood what had happened. Brian was his friend, and he didn't want Deirdre and Costa to get away with it. He knew Brian wasn't the killer, but he was terribly afraid of Costa. He realized that both he and Brian were in danger. The investigators believed the witness because it aligned with what they observed at the crime scene. The police wanted to talk to Deirdre, and they got lucky. She showed up at the police station herself. She confirmed Taylor's words but claimed that the idea to kill Lisa belonged not to her but to her lover. Lisa had found out about her husband's affair and planned to divorce him. In the event of a divorce, Costa would be left bankrupt, but if Lisa died, he hoped to receive a $700,000 insurance payout. In addition to that, Deirdre revealed that the bar was actually a front for money laundering. Costa had a business partner in Greece who produced counterfeit banknotes. That's why he hired street teenagers who didn't ask too many questions. The FBI had suspicions about this, but they didn't have evidence yet. Deirdre admitted that besides Taylor, she approached at least 3 other teenagers with an offer to kill Lisa. The initial plan was to attack Lisa at a Halloween party. However, her friend Taja James, who agreed to carry out the task, got scared of the crowd surrounding the victim. The next incident was the one Lisa reported to the police. After Taja's failures, Deirdre persuaded Brian to commit the crime, promising him $5,000. He was supposed to stage a car accident and then shoot her in the head. But Brian's car simply wouldn't start. The next time he tried to break into the house, he was scared off by the neighbors. Only on the 3rd attempt did he manage to get close to Lisa. Costa disabled the alarm, so the young man entered the house unimpeded, walked straight into the bedroom, and shot the sleeping young woman. He was supposed to shoot again, but the gun jammed, and while he was struggling with it, Costa emptied his entire magazine into him. Costa had initially planned to kill Brian to appear as a hero. But when he realized his wife was alive, he and Deirdre started brainstorming how to finish the job. They decided to dress Deirdre as a nurse and deliver a bomb disguised as flowers to Lisa's ward. Fortunately, the police were guarding Lisa's room, and this plan also failed. Deirdre's story seemed so incredible that the investigators could barely believe it. But it didn't end there. In an almost casual tone, sipping on a Diet Cola and taking a drag from her cigarette, Deirdre claimed that she and Costa had killed before. Their victim was a young man, 19-year-old Mark Kevin Ramsey, who worked at Co-Star's bar. The young man knew about the money laundering, but, unlike most teenagers who kept their mouths shut, he believed he deserved a share. He threatened to blackmail Costa, and Costa fired him. However, supposedly impressed by the young man's audacity, Costa offered Kevin to join a secret club of hired assassins. According to his words, it was an elite group of trained killers who received thousands of dollars for complex tasks ordered by the CIA. Costa mentioned that all recruits had to undergo an initiation ritual. Kevin agreed and allowed himself to be taken to the woods and bound. Costa promised that he and Deirdre would simply shoot near his feet for a few minutes to make sure he wouldn't flinch and would be capable of such work. Suddenly, Costa gave Deirdre a signal and she shot Kevin 3 times in the chest. Because it wasn't Kevin's initiation, it was Deirdre's. Then she approached the young man, grabbed him by the hair, lifted his head, and shot him in the temple. After that, Costa took his AK-47 and fired a final shot into Kevin's head. Then they both left without even untying their victim. As a successfully completed initiation ritual, Costa gave Deirdre a black beret and promised to make a monogram for the secret club when she tracked down and killed the next target. Upon hearing this story, the investigators began to suspect that they were dealing with a deranged person. The murder of a teenager whose disappearance wasn't even reported. Her words seemed too far-fetched to believe. To expose the liar, they asked her to lead them to Kevin's body. Without hesitation, Deirdre showed them the way. The Coeur boy's body still lay in the woods, where the lovers had left him, but that wasn't all. Deirdre made an even more significant statement that caused a sensation. She claimed the existence of a video capturing Kevin's execution. Initially, Deirdre was enthused about the recording, but then she realized that Costa would use it to keep her as his accomplice under control. Was the girl trying to portray her lover as a psychopath to protect herself? Or was there really a video that would lift the veil of secrecy over the hired assassins club? The investigators had to ascertain this. Costa, of course, denied everything, but upon obtaining a search warrant, the police found a cassette in his garage. It was a fully captured video of the teenager's murder. The boy screamed in pain and terror so intensely that the police officers in the room took a while to recover from what they had witnessed. But the crucial evidence in the recording was that Deirdre followed the instructions of a man behind the camera, a man with a distinct Greek accent. Simultaneously, the police unearthed the sports bag mentioned by Lisa. Inside were an AK-47 and the .22 caliber pistol, which the two had used during Kevin's murder. Deirdre Michelle Hunt and Konstantinos Fotopoulos were charged with the murder of Kevin, Brian, and the attempted murder of Lisa. During Deirdre's trial, prosecutors portrayed her as a ruthless and cold-blooded killer, but during Costar's trial, they presented her as his victim, someone who believed in his fabrications about secret agents and an exclusive club of top-notch assassins. The prosecutors themselves admitted to perceiving Deirdre's role differently in this case and couldn't agree on the matter. Perhaps the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Deirdre's mother testified in her favor, confessing to mistreating her daughter when she was a child. Deirdre saw nothing but chaos in her life, so it's not surprising that she fell under Costar's influence. According to her testimony, Costa physically and psychologically tortured her, extinguished cigarettes on her, burned her with an iron, and committed other atrocities. An hour before the verdict was announced, she decided to admit her guilt in the crime to avoid the death penalty. However, the judge showed no sympathy towards her. Watching the video of Kevin's murder was enough for him to sentence her to death. Deirdre appealed based on the fact that while she was in prison, awaiting the opportunity to testify against Costa, her lawyer struck a deal with a television show to sell her interview for $5,000. Deceptively, he brought the filming crew to his client, claiming it was merely preparation for her testimony in court, but once there, he revealed they were journalists and persuaded her not to resist and to tell her story. The lawyer was banned from practicing law for a year as punishment. Deirdre's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Costa, who was also sentenced to death, filed appeals, but they were unsuccessful. He is still awaiting the execution of his sentence and possibly enjoying some attention by entertaining viewers with his tales about the CIA. Fortunately, even in this story, there are some positives. The doctors chose not to remove the bullet from Lisa's head, but she fully recovered and continues to lead a normal life, carrying on her father's work in Daytona Beach. She married a wonderful person and left behind the story with Costa and the 6 unsuccessful attempts on her life far behind her. Jose was not an ordinary guy, quite the opposite. He felt that he could get anything he wanted from life, not because he was capable or deserving of it, but simply because he desired it so much. He didn't like blending in with the crowd. He wanted to stand out, to make people tremble with fear of the sight of him. Jose was tough, just like his friends. They always had each other's backs, did everything together, and on that night when Jose saw a ring with the letter E engraved on it, he knew he had to have it because his girlfriend's name was Esther. He thought it would be a perfect romantic gesture. So he leaned over and took the ring off the lifeless girl's hand, a girl he and his friends had just killed. Jennifer Lee Ertman, who was 14 years old, and Elizabeth Christine Pena, who was 16, were best friends. Despite Jennifer being younger, she was obedient and well-mannered, and her positive influence had a wonderful impact on her friend Elizabeth. Elizabeth's parents were delighted that their daughter had such a reliable, faithful, and fantastic friend. The two girls shared an interest in makeup and fashion. They enjoyed dressing uniquely, skillfully applying makeup, and choosing accessories. They attended the same school in Houston, Texas, and were currently on summer vacation. Thursday, June 24, 1993 came around. A friend invited Elizabeth and Jennifer to a poolside party. At 4:45 p.m., Jennifer's father, Randy, dropped her off at Elizabeth's house, where at 8 p.m., Elizabeth's mother, Melissa, drove the girls to their friend Gina's house, who was hosting the party. The girls were excited and thrilled, enjoying the pleasant warm summer evening in the company of friends. Time flew by unnoticed, and the hour when their parents would expect them to be home was approaching. In principle, the parents weren't afraid to let the girls go out in the evening. They had cash with them just in case. Jennifer carried a pager and always kept $10 for a taxi in her pocket. And if they wanted their parents to pick them up, they only needed to find a telephone or a payphone and call. But this time, the girls decided to walk home. As they said their goodbyes to all their friends, the clock struck 10:45 and they were feeling the pressure of time. The girls had two options for walking home on foot. They could have taken the usual route by walking along the boulevard and turning onto the street leading to Elizabeth's house. This path would have taken them about half an hour. On the other hand, the park offered the possibility of saving 10 to 15 minutes. Despite their concerns about being late, they decided to go through the park. The route involved walking through the park, crossing a railway bridge, following a path, and eventually arriving at Elizabeth's house. Of course, at night, this route was dark and secluded, a place that teenage girls should avoid. However, many teenagers in the city casually used this shortcut. On the same night, Sandra Ertman woke up around 4 a.m. and noticed that the light in Jennifer's room was still on, which was unusual. Usually, when Jennifer came home, she would always turn off the light to let her parents know she had safely arrived and was going to sleep. Sandra assumed that Jennifer had stayed overnight at her friend Elizabeth's house without informing them. When her husband woke up a little later, he asked Sandra if their daughter had spent the night at Elizabeth's or Gina's house. Sandra replied that she wasn't sure. She wanted to cover for their daughter to avoid her father scolding her, but by 11 a.m., Sandra and Randy started calling Gina's and Elizabeth's families. The Pena family didn't answer the calls, presumably because they were at work. Around 1 p.m., Randy went to talk to Gina. She mentioned that she last saw the girls at 10:45 p.m. the previous night when they were heading to Elizabeth's house. Gina suggested that Randy should go together with her to the Pena family home. They did just that. Randy Ertman and Gina knocked on the door and even the windows of the house, calling out for Jennifer and Elizabeth, but received no response. Randy took Gina back home and returned to the Pena family's house. It was then that he finally met Adolfo and Melissa Pena. The parents of Elizabeth revealed that they hadn't seen the girls since the previous evening and assumed that their daughter was just sleeping in on her summer vacation, so they hadn't checked her room in the morning. They called the police, but initially, the authorities didn't take the disappearance of the girls seriously. In response, the families took matters into their own hands, printed flyers, went door to door asking neighbors if they had seen their daughters, but no one had any information. Adolfo came up with an idea to walk through the park since he knew about the short path to his house. He walked across the railway bridge and the path where the girls might have walked. Something urged him to check near the tree line, but fortunately, he didn't give in to that intuition. 4 days of uncertainty passed when a call came into the Crime Stoppers hotline. An anonymous caller reported that the girls were in the park. Officers immediately began the search. At the edge of the wooded area, an officer noticed something resembling an item of women's clothing. As he approached, he realized it was not just clothing but the bodies of the girls. The victims were lying on their backs just a few meters apart, naked, and their bodies had already greatly decomposed due to the summer heat. Insects were present, making it even more difficult for even experienced police officers to look at the bodies. Initially, they wanted to keep the horrifying find hidden from reporters and the public, but the news spread rapidly. Randy Ertman was speaking with journalists about his daughter's disappearance when a reporter informed him over the radio that the bodies had been found in the park. Randy persuaded the reporters to take him to the park. Police officers had to restrain him as he attempted to break through the police tape, shouting, "She has light hair. Tell me one of them has light hair." He only stepped back when a detective told him that he couldn't provide any information yet and needed Jennifer's dental records. It was then that Randy understood the officers were trying to shield him from the sight of the bodies, an image he would never be able to forget. Dental records confirmed that the bodies found in the park belonged to 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman and 16-year-old Elizabeth Pena. The cause of death was strangulation. Several shoe prints were discovered around the bodies, indicating that there were multiple perpetrators involved. Now, when the girls were found, the police were determined to find those responsible for their deaths. Although it was assumed that the call to Crime Stoppers could be entirely anonymous, the police traced it back. The call led them to the home of the Kent family. The homeowner, Joe Kent, admitted to making the call. He listed several names and claimed that these individuals were the ones who killed the girls. Among them was his own brother, Peter Kent. The police searched Peter's room and found jewelry belonging to the girls, which confirmed Joe's statement. But what exactly happened that night? So, Jennifer and Elizabeth decided to take a shortcut through the park because they had promised their parents to return before the designated time. It was around 11 o'clock, and the park was not a particularly safe place for two young girls at that time. Nevertheless, they walked through the park and encountered two young men. The guys' names were Frank and Roman Sandoval. They didn't say anything to the girls, didn't attempt to harass, shout, or whistle at them. They simply passed by. It would have been wonderful if they had told Jennifer and Elizabeth about the gang meeting taking place in the park and advised them to turn around and go in a different direction. That would have saved them. However, the brothers just walked past. Soon after, they heard a woman's scream. Did they realize what was happening? Yes, of course, they did. But they didn't do anything. They just left. The twin brothers, Frank and Roman, had just attended a ceremony for initiating a new gang member, which was held in the park. 6 young people aged between 14 and 18 took part in the ceremony. Essentially, they were all teenagers. The participants included 18-year-olds Jose Medin, Derek Sean O'Brien, and Peter Kentua, as well as 17-year-old Efren Perez and 14-year-old Venancio Medin, the younger brother of Jose. The new 17-year-old gang member whose initiation was taking place was named Raul the Ariel. So, besides the Sandoval brothers, the 6 teenagers gathered in the park to initiate the new gang member. The initiation was quite peculiar. Raul had to fight with each of the guys for 5 minutes. He didn't succeed entirely, but they accepted him nonetheless.
After the formal part, if you can call it that, the guys stayed in the park, drinking and chatting. Suddenly, Frank Sandoval had an uneasy feeling and insisted that he and his brother leave. Following the twins, 18-year-old Jose Medin and his 14-year-old brother were about to leave when suddenly Jose noticed Elizabeth. He attempted to grab her chest, but she pushed his hand away and wanted to continue walking. However, this was not part of Jose's plans. He said, "No, little girl, where do you think you're going?" and put his hand around her neck, dragging her down the small slope. Jennifer was walking slightly ahead and had already passed the spot where the gang's initiation was taking place. She had every chance to escape and save herself, but upon hearing Elizabeth's cries, she rushed to help her. Not many would have intervened in such a situation, but Jennifer acted exactly like that. She saw only Jose and thought that she and Elizabeth could handle one guy together, giving her a real chance to save her friend. She probably didn't suspect that there were 5 more teenagers down the slope. So when Jennifer rushed back to Elizabeth, other members of the gang grabbed her and knocked her to the ground. The guys forced the girls to take off their clothes and underwear, and for the next hour 5 guys in turn, and sometimes at the same time, mocked Jennifer and Elizabeth. 14-year-old Venancio Medai and watched in amazement. Later, he will tell how the girls fought off their attackers. Jennifer bit the assailants, while Elizabeth kicked the air and screamed. They were, of course, weaker than the 6 teenagers, the boys, but they still did everything they could to escape. During the attack, the victims often looked at each other, which made them cry even harder. At first, Elizabeth didn't cry, she was more in anger. However, seeing what the boys were doing to Jennifer, tears started streaming down her cheeks as well. The boys approvingly patted each other on the back when they switched places and crudely insulted the girls. Even Jose dared to ask Elizabeth for her name and phone number while mocking her. 14-year-old Venancio Medin watched the attack in horror. When he asked to hang out with his older brother, he probably didn't expect anything like this. He also didn't want to participate in the relentless abuse, but he feared the other boys. So, after their instructions, he also mistreated Jennifer. It is reported that he was the only one who asked his brother and Peter Kent to release the girls, but Peter whispered to him that they saw their faces and could identify them. The leader of the group, 18-year-old Peter Kent, declared that they must not allow the victims to be identified later. The newcomer, Raoul, yelled at Jennifer, ordering her to kneel. He and Sean O'Brien began choking Jennifer with Sean's red shoelaces. But they tore apart, and they had to finish what they started with the girls' shoelaces. Elizabeth, who was forced to witness Jennifer's murder, pleaded with the boys to spare her, offering to give them her phone number so they could meet up and hang out if they let her go. She did and said everything she could to save her life. However, it didn't work, and Elizabeth made one last desperate attempt to escape. Unfortunately, she was intercepted. Peter Kent always boasted about his steel-toed boots. It was with those boots that he attacked the girl, breaking her ribs and knocking out several teeth. Then, Peter, Jose, and Efren strangled Elizabeth with shoelaces. At that moment, they noticed Jennifer was still alive, and they started stomping on the victims' bodies and necks to ensure their demise. It was a monstrous murder of the girls, who simply wanted to take a shortcut so their parents wouldn't scold them. Without a shred of remorse, the killers divided the spoils, the few pieces of jewelry that belonged to Jennifer and Elizabeth. They even took the watch with Goofy, a Disney character that Jennifer liked. On the first ring was engraved the letter E, and Jose took the ring to give it to his girlfriend, Esther. After committing the crime, several boys went to Peter's place, where his brother Joe and his 16-year-old wife, Christina, were present. Christina noticed that they were covered in blood, disheveled, as if they had just been in a fight. They threw the bloodied items at her and ordered her to get rid of them. Christina asked what had happened, and Jose replied that they had just had some fun. Then they began relishing the details of what they had done, showing enthusiasm and boasting, without any sign of remorse.
It disgusted Christina and Joe to hear this, but they pretended that everything was normal and silently listened. Christina herself had been a victim of violence in the past, and the actions of the gang deeply affected her. When the boys left, she told her husband that he should call the police anonymously. Joe was hesitant because it wasn't just about his brother but also about the other gang members who could seek revenge against him. However, Christina couldn't bear the thought of the girls lying in the park without their families having a proper chance to say goodbye to them. She convinced Joe to make an anonymous call to Crime Stoppers, ensuring that nobody would know it was him. The next day, Joe made the call in a hushed tone, informing the police where to find the bodies. Initially, the police didn't find anything, but after 4 days, a persistent officer eventually discovered the crime scene. Undoubtedly, Christina and Joe were very scared when the police traced the anonymous call, but they had made the right decision in doing so. On June 29, 1993, all 6 members of the gang were arrested. The red nail polish belt they used to try to strangle Jennifer was found in O'Brien's apartment. During the interrogations, the friendship between the boys came to an abrupt end. Each of them claimed to have been in the park, but others were the ones who killed the girls. The police pieced together the full picture of how events unfolded that night. Nearly all the details about what happened were known thanks to the testimony of 14-year-old Venanzio Medellin. The boys were tried separately, so the families had to listen to the horrifying details of their daughter's murders 5 times. Venanzio Medellin was the exception. He made a deal and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The other 5 were sentenced to the death penalty. In the cases of Jose Medellin, Derek O'Brien, and Peter Cantu, the sentences were carried out. Sean O'Brien and Jose Medellin found the courage to apologize to the victims' families, but Peter Cantu didn't even do that. Adolfo and Melissa Pena believe it doesn't matter, as he wouldn't say anything that would change anything. The sentences of Efren and Raul were changed to life imprisonment because they were 17 at the time of the crime, and the Supreme Court prohibited the execution of individuals who were younger than 18 when they committed the crime. The court proceedings were extremely difficult, not only because the victims' families had to listen to their daughter's torture 5 times, but also because the criminals' relatives accused Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents of allowing them to go to the park, even though their own relatives were drinking and fighting there too. Efren's stepfather approached Elizabeth's father and said in Spanish, "This is your fault for not raising your daughter properly." The most horrifying aspect of this story is that it wasn't the gang's first crime. Sean O'Brien, Peter Cantu, and Jose Medellin had already murdered a young mother, 27-year-old Patricia Lopez. She was waiting at a gas station for her husband to pick her up after her car broke down. The killers dragged her into the park, where they assaulted and strangled her with Sean O'Brien's red nail polish belt. O'Brien's fingerprints were found at the crime scene, and all of this happened 6 months before Jennifer and Elizabeth's murder. However, he was not charged for it. In addition to that, the criminals attacked random pedestrians on the street at least twice, including an armed robbery of another teenager and the murder of a completely unknown man. Despite the horror of the case, it had some positive consequences. Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents showed the world what it means to be a victim but not a helpless one. When the judge asked the parents if they wanted to address Peter Cantu, Randy Ertman immediately stood up and expressed everything he needed to say to Peter. Many criticized the judge for allowing Randy to yell at Peter. However, thanks to this, now after the sentencing, the victims' families have the right to address the perpetrator. They can also be present during the execution, which was previously prohibited. The families of Elizabeth and Jennifer visited the executions of the 3 killers. The families continue to fight for justice to this day. All 6 convicts appealed their sentences. Venanzio was denied parole 5 times, and each time the families met with the judges to prevent his release. Randy said, "I want this man to sit in jail for the rest of his life. I want this piece of crap to die in jail, and I will do everything in my power to keep him in jail. Do you want him as your neighbor?
Do you want him living next to you? Jennifer and Elizabeth had no choice. He had a choice. He could have walked away, but he didn't. Unfortunately, after his daughter's murder, Randy tried to find solace at the bottom of a bottle. But after 5 years, he pulled himself together, quit drinking, and started the path of healing. He and his wife moved away because everything in their hometown reminded them of their daughter. In 2014, at the age of 61, Randy Erkman passed away from lung cancer. Jennifer was his only daughter, and he fought not only for her but for the other victims as well. Thanks to him, other victims' families now have more rights and opportunities. Several years before the John Benet Ramsey case, America was trying to solve the mystery of the disappearance of 7-year-old Jacqueline Dovalibi. Was she abducted by a stranger who entered her home under the cover of night? Or did she become a victim within her own family? The police were convinced that the culprits were always in plain sight, whereas no one who knew the family doubted their complete innocence. Midlothian, located in the state of Illinois, USA, is a small town where everyone knows each other. It is situated approximately 30 minutes south of the bustling streets of Chicago and is considered a quiet suburb where there is always a sense of being in a familiar place. However, in 1988, the town changed forever when 7-year-old Jacqueline Dovalibi disappeared from her own bedroom in the middle of the night. Jacqueline lived in a cozy ranch-style home with her parents, David and Cynthia, and her 4-year-old brother, Davy. The family resided in a beautiful location surrounded by several nature preserves, all within walking distance from their home. Jacqueline's biological father, Jimmy Guess, had no involvement in her life after a bitter divorce from Cynthia shortly after their daughter was born. David Dovalibi adopted Jacqueline when he married Cynthia 5 years ago when Jacqueline was 2 years old, and he was the only father she knew. Cynthia worked as a dietitian at the local hospital, and David was a carpenter who had been promoted to a foreman. David and Jacqueline had an instant connection, often going fishing and bowling together. According to one neighbor whose daughter was friends with Jacqueline, she was a happy little girl who never showed any signs of sadness or anger. According to all accounts, the Dovalibis were a typical, close-knit suburban family. On the evening of September 10, 1988, Cynthia took Jacqueline and Davy to a nearby KFC Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant, while David met up with his friends and went bowling. When all family members returned home, they watched television, and Jacqueline, wearing her favorite purple and white pajamas, kissed Cynthia and David goodnight. What exactly happened in the house that night remains unclear, but the next morning, the little brunette with brown eyes was no longer there. David and his son woke up earlier than the other family members on the next morning, and around 7:45, David noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. At first, he thought that his mother, who lived with the family, had left it open and didn't worry much about it. He prepared breakfast for Davy and turned on the television. A little later, Cynthia woke up and went to wake up their daughter but couldn't find Jacqueline in her bedroom. The parents called Jacqueline's friends, thinking that she might have gone outside to play. While they searched for the child inside the house and in the neighborhood, Cynthia noticed that the basement window was broken and wide open. David immediately called the police and reported his daughter's disappearance. After investigators arrived at the house, Cynthia and David explained that none of them had heard anything unusual during the night, and they had all been sound asleep. Nothing was missing from the house except Jacqueline's blanket, which matched the colors of her pajamas. Furthermore, there were no signs of a struggle. Investigators needed to determine whether someone had broken into the house and taken Jacqueline, or if she had left the house herself, only to be taken by someone else. Although there were no phone calls or ransom notes, the FBI agents took over the investigation, presuming that they were dealing with a kidnapping rather than a runaway case. Soon, the news of a possible abduction spread throughout the town. The suburb mainly consisted of families with young children, and the possibility that someone had broken into a family's home and abducted their little girl in the middle of the night while everyone was asleep was a horrifying revelation. Considering that there were no signs of a struggle, investigators began to wonder if the girl might have left with someone she knew. If the intruder had entered the house through the broken basement window, they needed to be familiar with the layout of the house to enter the girl's room without waking the other family members, investigators concluded. We are looking at it with an open mind as a potential abduction, but also as an abduction with someone known to the family, said Police Captain John Bitton. This statement led Cynthia to recall an unsettling incident that occurred several years earlier. After a bitter custody battle during which her former partner, Jimmy Guest, did everything in his power to keep their daughter with him, he had broken into their home and attempted to take their daughter. Therefore, Cynthia suspected his involvement in Jacqueline's disappearance because she knew he was capable of such actions. Jacqueline's grandmother, Anne Dovalibi, admits that she wasn't initially worried about her granddaughter's safety because she believed that Jacqueline had been taken by her biological father, and she was confident they would quickly get her back. However, she couldn't have known that Jimmy had been in prison in Florida for the previous 4 months during Jacqueline's disappearance and was soon ruled out as a suspect. Suspicion also fell on Jacqueline's uncle, Timothy Guest, who lived nearby and suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, he had an alibi. It was at this point that Cynthia began to worry that something bad had happened to her daughter. The parents of the girl, Cynthia and David, were questioned multiple times in the following days. They didn't hide anything. They explained that Jacqueline had gone to bed at 10 p.m., and when Cynthia went to check on her at 11 p.m., she was sound asleep. The police became increasingly skeptical of the parents' story. It was difficult for them to believe that a person unfamiliar with the layout of the house could have crawled through the basement window without disturbing the towel dryer right beneath the window. Then, they would have had to walk down the hallway to the girl's room and take her away without waking any of the other family members. The only sign that a stranger had been in the house was the broken window. No fingerprints or signs of a struggle were found. Indeed, when it comes to fingerprints and other evidence, it's important to note that the police themselves made a series of mistakes that could have influenced their conclusions. They never secured the girl's room to prevent anyone from entering it, and they didn't thoroughly search the house. A forensic expert took photographs, but he didn't even bother to take close-up pictures of the broken window. He checked the window and the front door for fingerprints, but not the back door. What was even more astonishing was that the police allowed friends of the family to clean up their house and even sweep away the glass from the broken window. The police just stood by and watched as they cleaned up, destroying any evidence that the kidnapper might have left behind. Immediately after the girl's disappearance, Jacqueline's parents were asked to take a polygraph test. Cynthia was too distraught for such a test. Friends recalled that she was in a terrible state, constantly feeling nauseous. David underwent the polygraph test, which he passed. But in the minds of the police, everything seemed to point to the parents. The number of potential suspects sharply narrowed after one of the forensic experts stated that, in his opinion, the basement window had been broken from the inside. On September 14th, 5 days after the girl's disappearance, the parents attempted to take a polygraph test again. Cynthia's results were inconclusive due to her emotional state. David's results were also inconclusive, and the polygraph examiner accused him of not cooperating with the investigation. David in turn claimed that the polygraph examiner instructed him to answer yes to all questions, including the question, "Did you kill your daughter?" to which David refused to answer yes. Afterward, David was taken into an interrogation room and was not released for 5 hours. Later that evening, Michael Chapman pulled into the parking lot of the Islander Apartments on 1912 Canal Street in Blue Island, a town located about 5 kilometers from the girl's home. When Chapman exited his car, he noticed an unpleasant odor in the fresh autumn air. He spotted something wrapped up in the grass, which he described as a wrapped-up object. As he approached, he saw a head and a hand, and he immediately ran inside to call the police. Jacqueline's body was discovered, and she was still bound with a 2-meter rope, which was considered evidence of the crime. Her soiled underwear was found about 60 centimeters from her body. As for the police, they continued to question Jacqueline's father for about 1.5 hours without informing him that his daughter had been found. They tried to convince him to confess to the crime. When Officer Kevin Shaughnessy finally told him about Jacqueline's discovery, David didn't believe him, thinking it was another police trick to make him confess. This is likely why he responded with the phrase, "I guess you think I should cry now?" However, Officer Shaughnessy interpreted these words differently, and they convinced him not to pursue other suspects. In any case, there was no evidence against David, and he was released to go home, where he found his distraught wife and realized that his daughter was truly gone. By morning, with the help of dental records, the body was officially identified as Jacqueline Dowaliby. Initially, based solely on the appearance of the body, there was speculation that she had been struck on the head, but the Cook County coroner Dr. Robert Stein, stated that the condition of the body was the result of rapid decomposition due to the unusually warm September weather. Dr. Stein could not determine with certainty whether the girl had been sexually assaulted or not due to the state of decomposition. Although the exact time of death couldn't be determined either, Robert Stein concluded that she had been dead for several days, and the terrible crime was most likely committed early Saturday morning, right after her disappearance. After the body was identified, and given that they had been individually questioned for hours before Jacqueline was found, both Cynthia and David hired lawyers who advised them to invoke their Fifth Amendment rights and not answer any more questions from investigators. They had already told the police everything they knew, provided blood and urine samples, and gave permission for investigators to examine any family medical records that might be relevant. They also allowed investigators access to their home for all 5 days that Jacqueline was missing. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution allows citizens to refuse to answer any questions that may incriminate them. The Dowalabys had every right to invoke the Fifth Amendment. However, with no other suspects, law enforcement focused their attention on Cynthia and David as the primary suspects and claimed that it was suspicious that they were not cooperating with investigators. Police rushed to accuse the family of refusing to cooperate with the investigation. Prosecutor Patrick O'Brien explained, "Even if you are being looked at as a suspect, and you know deep down inside that you didn't do this, and it's unfair, the idea of not cooperating with the police that are investigating the murder of your daughter seems overly concerned about your personal interests." On the day after the funeral, a team of 20 police officers executed search warrants at the Dowalaby home. They emerged from the house with several large bags containing items they wanted to examine in the laboratory. Additionally, they confiscated the family's blue Chevrolet Malibu. Months passed, but there were no updates or new information about the case. However, the police made a statement indicating that the family members had not been excluded as suspects. Cynthia's lawyer, Lawrence Hyman, criticized the police investigation, calling it a blatant violation of the law. While Cynthia and David continued to avoid communicating with the media, they had a multitude of supporters. Neighbors stood by the family, telling journalists that the Dowalabys were a loving and caring family, and they had never heard either of the parents raise their voice at Jacqueline or Davy. David's boss, Ross Patterson, recalled, "The only time David took a day off work was when he needed to get documents for Jacqueline's adoption. However, this did not convince the investigators. Adhering to the theory that Cynthia and David could be involved in the crime, they returned to the location where the body was found and began showing photos of Cynthia, David, and their car to residents of the Islander apartments, hoping to find any witnesses who might have seen them in the area." On November 22nd, Cynthia and David were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Their son Davy was placed under the care of the Department of Family and Children's Services. It became known that a tenant of the apartment complex where the body was found had told investigators that he had seen David in a blue Chevy Malibu in the parking lot. A witness, a 35-year-old city transportation worker named Everett Mann, said that around 2 a.m. on September 10th, he was pulling into the parking lot, and his headlights illuminated a blue Chevy with a driver he claimed was David Dowalaby. During Cynthia and David's arrest, they were deliberately paraded in front of the media so that as many photos as possible could be taken, seemingly to convey the message, "Look, we've done our job." Detectives boasted about having a wealth of evidence against David and Cynthia, including 2 witnesses. However, it remained unclear why loving parents would act this way towards their daughter. Were there enough pieces of evidence? Or were the investigators rushing to take the case to court for some reason? Perhaps the answer to this question lies in the fact that on the same day as the parents' arrest, a major news story emerged. Richard M. Daley, the state's chief prosecutor whose office was handling the case, announced his candidacy for mayor of Chicago. Critics accused him of using a high-profile crime in his political game, but despite the criticism, Daley became the mayor of Chicago, and the case was handed over to the court. It is widely known that eyewitness testimonies are highly unreliable. Nevertheless, the witness statements suggesting that David was near the crime scene were enough to charge him and his wife with first-degree murder. Blue Island Police Chief Paul Greaves referred to these witness testimonies as excellent evidence that allowed them to rule out other leads. The police never disclosed what those other leads were, but relying solely on witness testimony to exclude all other possibilities seemed somewhat prejudicial.
especially considering that Cynthia was not linked to the crime scene. Both spouses were denied bail, and it was revealed that Cynthia was in the early stages of pregnancy. In the search for new evidence, the police decided to focus on the couple's 5-year-old son, Davy, who was examined by a doctor. Supposedly, the doctor found traces on his body that could have resulted from a belt, some of which were old while others were recent. The police suspected that Cynthia and David had abused Davy at home, suggesting it could be a motive for the crime. Patrick Murphy, Davy's state-appointed guardian, said that the police and prosecutors continuously questioned the child for days. He added that after speaking with Davy and reviewing his medical records, he couldn't understand how they arrived at such a conclusion because he couldn't find anything that indicated violence against the child. He also mentioned that Davy constantly pleaded to see his parents, and he missed them greatly. In mid-December, Cynthia and David were released on bail, but Davy was not allowed to return home with his parents. He was placed in the custody of David's sister Rose and her husband John. Davy was only allowed to see his parents during supervised visits. In April 1990, the court proceedings began. It became clear early on that the evidence gathered by law enforcement was not as compelling as initially reported. The prosecutors didn't even have a clear motive for the crime, but fortunately for them, they were not legally obligated to provide one. Their main argument was straightforward. There were no outsiders in the house, so the Dovalibys must be guilty. The defense argued that due to the poor police work, it was impossible to determine how the intruder had entered the house and what had transpired inside during that night. The idea that the intruder needed to know the layout of the house to find Jacqueline's bedroom seemed far-fetched. The family lived in a typical ranch-style house. Many such houses are built with a similar layout. Anyone who had ever been inside a similar house would likely know the layout. The prosecutors also tried to argue that the intruder had to navigate through a window without disturbing objects below, such as a vanity, a TV stand, and a towel rack. To demonstrate that this was possible, David filmed a video showing how a neighbor climbed through the basement window, propped his leg on the wall, and didn't disturb any objects below. Furthermore, it turned out that the prosecution had only one witness, not two. Everett Mann, the key prosecution witness, admitted during the trial that he had identified David solely by his prominent nose. He was about 70 meters away from the man in the parking lot and only remembered his distinctive nose, as it was dark and the lighting was quite dim. Moreover, during the photo identification, Everett was shown a frontal picture of David, while he had only seen the person in profile. Additionally, David's photo was much larger than the 4 photos of other men. Everett admitted that the person he saw that night could have been African American or Caucasian, or even a man or a woman, and all he saw was a silhouette that only looked male. In a night without moonlight, 3 weeks into the trial, the jury members were taken to the same parking lot where Everett had supposedly seen David. They stood in the same spot under similar conditions as Everett. They could hardly see anything. In reality, they couldn't even notice a nearby garbage can, which was said to be near where the car was parked. Several neighbors of the Dovalibys also contradicted the witness's account regarding the car. The defense lawyers built their case around the fact that a remarkably similar crime occurred in the same neighborhood about a year after Jacqueline's abduction. On September 2, 1989, Perry Hernandez broke into a home in Blue Island and kidnapped a 6-year-old girl while her family slept. He entered by breaking a window and made his way inside without waking anyone. The man took the girl to a railroad bridge near the Calumet River, tormented her, and then allowed her to return home. This happened within 1.5 miles of where Jacqueline was found. An interesting detail emerged. The girl Hernandez was living with at the time also owned a Chevy Malibu, and Perry often stayed overnight at her apartment. In fact, even on the night before Jacqueline's disappearance, someone had entered another home in Midlothian. Elizabeth Siki woke up in the middle of the night and thwarted an attempted robbery or abduction of her daughter. She identified the person she saw in her home that night as Perry Hernandez and expressed confidence that he intended to abduct her 7-year-old daughter, whom she found tightly wrapped in 3 towels, as if someone had intended to take her away. While this may seem like more than a coincidence, Judge Richard Neville stated that he did not consider this evidence and prohibited Cynthia and David's defense from presenting these facts in court. However, the little girl abducted by Perry Hernandez was invited to testify.
She recalled that while she was with the kidnapper under the bridge, he held a rope, as if threatening her with it. Besides the striking similarities between the two cases, this demonstrated that a small child could indeed be taken from a bedroom without waking anyone. However, in court, the defense made a mistake by failing to establish a connection with the jury members. They wanted David to take the witness stand and firmly declare his innocence, looking them in the eye, but that didn't happen. The most significant obstacle for the defense turned out to be the 17 autopsy photographs and remains presented to the jury. The prosecutors claimed that the photos were meant to help determine the time and cause of death. The defense believed that these photos simply contributed to bias among the jury members. An attorney explains, "You're shown a beautiful girl next to a photograph of her body, and of course the jury members thought someone must pay for this crime. However, the photos didn't convince the judge, who dropped the charges against Cynthia because her only connection to the crime was being in the house. The judge ordered to keep his decision secret because David's fate still lay in the hands of the jury due to the testimony of Everett Mann. After 14 hours, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty. Everyone believed that David would be acquitted, and the media were already waiting for him outside the courthouse for interviews. It was a shock to everyone that he was found guilty. The judge sentenced David to 45 years in prison. Many didn't understand why the jury had no doubts about his guilt, but suddenly everything fell into place. In an interview with a reporter, the jury foreperson confessed why a guilty verdict was reached. It turns out that the jury saw photographs of the Dovalibby home. In one photo, the bedroom door of young Davy showed a dent from a fist, and the jurors believed this indicated David Dovalibby's violent nature. Coming to this conclusion, the jury members decided that there had been a lot of violence in the house. How wrong they were. The fist-sized dent had appeared long before David moved into the house with Cynthia, and perhaps even before Jacqueline's birth. David's younger brother had struck the door with his fist when he was a teenager. The house belonged to David's mother, and the family always had more important things to spend money on, and the door was never replaced. Neither the defense nor the prosecution mentioned this dent, so the jury's decision was based on things that were not even discussed in court. The jury foreperson added that if they had their way, they would have accused Cynthia as well. During this time, Cynthia fought for custody of Davy. Several psychologists and social workers testified, stating that there was no hint that Davy had ever been mistreated, and Cynthia was a kind and loving mother who doted on Davy, and he on her. By mid-July, Davy was allowed to return home to his mother and his recently born sister, Carly Marie. The fact that the jury was biased against David needed to be used to challenge the verdict. Cynthia and the family's friends formed a committee to fight for David's release. One committee member offered a $10,000 reward for any information about the crime. Additionally, the committee allowed them to connect with people who could assist with the case. One of those people turned out to be Robert Byman, an attorney from the Chicago law firm Jenner and Block, who volunteered to work on the case pro bono. Initially, due to police statements, he also believed in David's guilt. But after studying the case materials, he realized there was no evidence against him at all. He understood that David was wrongly accused due to human nature. Byman explained, 12 good and decent members of the jury were entrusted with deciding the fate of this case. Their choice was simple, to stand up and leave, saying, "Sorry, Jacqueline, we can't do anything for you," or to convict the only person sitting before them. They chose the latter. In October, Robert Byman filed a petition for David's release based on new evidence. Gerald Bauman, a prisoner at Cook County Jail, claimed that he had overheard Perry Hernandez confess to the murder. However, after the petition was filed, Gerald refused to sign his previously given sworn statements, fearing for his safety, and claimed that he had received threats after news of this new evidence came to light. The appeal garnered such a significant response that, for the first time, the Illinois Appellate Court allowed video recording of the case proceedings. The Illinois Appellate Court had three options: uphold the guilty verdict, order a new trial, or completely exonerate David, which would mean he could never be tried for this case again. 5 months later, the court's decision was announced. Complete exoneration. The court ruled that the chief witness's testimony had been inaccurate and unreliable, and the prosecutors had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that David was the only person with the opportunity to commit the crime. The judges noted that all the basement windows had been left unlocked that night,
and any of them could have allowed the perpetrator inside, but unfortunately they were not checked for fingerprints. They also criticized the decision to show the jury 17 gruesome body photographs that were unnecessary. On November 13, 1991, after spending 18 months in prison, David walked free. I've been a lawyer for almost 30 years, and in all that time there have only been 3 times when I was as happy as I was the day I walked David Dovalibi out of prison. Our judicial system is designed to work in 95% of cases. This time the system failed. It convicted an innocent man, said Robert Byman. However, the Dovalibi family was about to experience yet another shocking turn of events in one of the most paradoxical and unusual murder sagas in modern Chicago history. It became known that Rob Warden and David Protess, who were writing a book about the case titled Gone in the Night, had discovered a new potential suspect. Timothy Guess was a 31-year-old brother of Jacqueline's biological father. Timothy had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and lived in a house with his mother not far from Jacqueline's home. Initially, he claimed to have been working at the Park Avenue restaurant in Harvey on the night of the murder, and 3 restaurant employees confirmed his alibi. However, now 2 of them had recanted their statements. At least 5 regulars of the establishment also claimed that Timothy wasn't there that night. Warden and Protess spoke to Timothy, who told them that he often heard voices in his head and suffered from memory lapses. He told them that he was guided by a spirit, and this spirit had allowed him to describe the layout of the Dovalibi house, even though he had never been inside. He could even describe how to get to Jacqueline's bedroom. Timothy described the blanket in which the body was wrapped, and somehow knew that the light in the bedroom was off on the night of her disappearance. However, Timothy was never seriously considered a suspect even after this information came to light. He passed away in 2002. Protest said, "I felt that the case was solved, but I never thought anyone would be held accountable for the crime. The state would be too embarrassed to admit they had wrongly accused Cynthia and David." Since then, the Dovalibi family has moved and changed their last name due to the excessive attention on their lives. They still hope that Jacqueline's murder will be solved. Something terrible happened in that ranch-style home in Midlothian, Illinois, on the night of September 9, 1988. But 3 decades later, there are still no answers as to what exactly transpired. While the local police claim the case is open, there are evidently no leads being pursued. Every U.S. citizen has the right to invoke the Fifth Amendment, but when Cynthia and David exercised that right, they found themselves at the center of a wrongly and negligently conducted investigation. Kauai is the Hawaiian island garden, rightfully bearing the title of one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Tourists come here to enjoy an unforgettable vacation, with jagged coastal cliffs, lush tropical forests, and no one notices the not-so-young man, alone, handing out leaflets and telling the story of his brutally murdered daughter, Sandra. When Sandra Gallus was found strangled, the police quickly narrowed down the suspects to 2. The case seemed crystal clear and straightforward, but it took many years before justice prevailed, all thanks to one determined father. Standing at his daughter's grave, he vowed that as long as he lived, she would not be forgotten, and her case would be solved. This is the story of a father who remained the driving force behind the investigation, setting himself the goal of securing the conviction of his daughter's killer and allowing nothing to stand in his way. Sandra, the daughter of Toshi and Larry Mendonca, was born in Japan, her mother's homeland. However, the family later decided to move to the island of Kauai, closer to Larry's parents, as they were getting older and needed assistance. The family lived on a ranch, and Sandra and her older brother Lawrence Jr. adored the place. Few children could boast of having a waterfall right by their home. They spent a lot of time walking on the beach, swimming, and when they got hungry, they were surrounded by 2 fruit orchards where mangoes and citrus fruits grew. Sandra was very determined, responsible, and achieved her goals. From the age of 5, Sandra practiced gymnastics, performed in a cheerleading group at school, continued to participate in sports, and attended numerous clubs and groups, all while being raised in an environment that valued both Japanese and Portuguese traditions. The family's father, Larry, was a veteran of the Air Force, raising his children with discipline. In fact, he sought to instill independence and self-reliance in his daughter and son, insisting that Sandra pursue her higher education in Honolulu. The city seemed enormous to the girl from the small island, but she missed her native island of Kauai and her family, and visited as often as she could. It was during one of these visits that she met Darren. During the summer break of 1999, Sandra found temporary work at a transportation company where she met her future husband, Darren Gallus. She was 21, he was closer to 30, and he immediately captivated the young, inexperienced girl. She fell head over heels for him, dropped out of university, and soon the young couple got married. 9 months later, their first child, Austin, was born, followed by Braden 2 years later. Sandra adored her boys, and the family life seemed happy until April 2005, when she went to her parents, visibly distraught. She told them that while she was taking things out of her husband's backpack, 2 slips of paper fell out, each with a different phone number. Sandra called these numbers and found out they belonged to 2 different married women. She demanded an explanation from her husband. He didn't admit to anything, insisting that he only had friendly relationships with the women. But Sandra knew it was a lie and realized she couldn't forgive her husband. By June, Darren had moved out of the family home, leaving Sandra to deal with the bills on her own. She began searching for work and landed a job as an assistant manager at a highly popular restaurant, considered one of the island's landmarks. Sandra seamlessly integrated into the restaurant staff, earning the appreciation of her colleagues, who joyfully watched as the quiet girl from the small island transformed into a confident, independent woman. She changed her image, spending more time with friends and relishing her newfound freedom. Moreover, she started receiving attention from one of the restaurant's chefs named Ryan Shinjo, who had recently moved to Kauai from Oahu. Sandra found these attentions very pleasing. Sandra's relationship with Ryan was nothing like her relationship with her ex-husband. The couple spent a lot of time together, going out, relaxing, attending concerts, and even traveling to Honolulu for shopping trips, where Ryan spoiled Sandra with expensive gifts, such as Louis Vuitton suitcases. It seemed that Sandra was very happy with her new boyfriend, and a new beautiful chapter of her life had begun. This continued until January 25, 2006, when Sandra's boss called her parents asking if they knew where their daughter was because she hadn't shown up for work. It was unusual for Sandra to miss work and not answer calls, but her parents, who were visiting her older brother in Dallas at the time, weren't worried, thinking she might have some urgent matters to attend to. However, at 3 o'clock in the morning, another call came in, a time when bad news usually arrives. Sandra's brother answered the call. Their father understood everything when he heard his son's prolonged scream, "No!" He would never forget that cry, dividing his life into before and after the murder of his daughter. Sandra was found by her boyfriend Ryan. Since no one could reach her at 9:30 p.m., he went to check if she was home. The door was locked and no one answered. However, he went around the house, looked through the ventilation gap below the garage, and thought he saw a girl in the car. He couldn't open the garage himself, so he called a friend who quickly arrived with tools. Sandra was indeed lying in the car. She was slumped to the right on the passenger seat, face down. Her body had long gone cold. Sandra's shirt and bra were twisted. Bruises adorned her face. Her lip was split, and there were clear marks on her neck from strangulation. She had been choked with something thin, resembling fishing line. However, the arriving police officers couldn't find anything resembling a murder weapon. The girl was killed early in the morning, 10 hours before Ryan arrived. But it was impossible to determine the exact time of death. All of Sandra's belongings, including her phone, remained in place. Nothing was missing from her purse, car, or home. There were also no signs of violence. In other words, it was obvious that whoever killed Sandra did so in a fit of rage. Fingerprints of Darren and Ryan were found, but since one of them had lived in the house until recently and the other had been in a relationship with her, it didn't raise suspicions. However, the fact that Ryan found the body raised questions. Why didn't he call 911 immediately and instead first asked a friend to come over? This wouldn't be the first time a killer tries to establish an alibi by enlisting a friend's support. During questioning, Ryan behaved strangely, clearly nervous, and officers felt he was withholding something. However, he had an alibi. He was at work, confirmed by his colleagues. Darren, on the other hand, was more intriguing. That morning, he called in sick to work, essentially lacking an alibi. Darren showed no reaction to Sandra's death but told investigators that he still loved his wife and wanted to reconcile. His colleagues revealed that 2 days before the murder, Darren, working on the road, saw Sandra and Ryan together as they drove past in her car. Witnesses said Darren exploded with rage. He was furious, tearing and throwing things. In other words, he had a motive and lacked an alibi for the time of the murder. He was detained, but the next day, lacking additional evidence, he was released. Days, weeks, and months passed without any progress in the case. Crushed by loss and yearning for answers, Sandra's father, Larry Mendonca, began his own investigation. A local resident and former military man, he had the connections and skills to piece together all the facts surrounding his daughter's murder. At that time, and this is crucial for the case, Sandra and Darren were disputing custody of their 2 sons. But Sandra worked evenings at the restaurant, and the boys stayed overnight with Darren. Sandra would pick them up at 6 in the morning, feed them breakfast, and get them ready for school and daycare. However, Larry learned that on the evening before her murder, Sandra stayed overnight at her boyfriend's house. He drove her home around 6 in the morning. Then, according to neighbors, she went to pick up the boys and quickly returned, but without the children. Larry also discovered that at 10 o'clock, his daughter had an appointment for a manicure at a salon 45 minutes away from her home. She never showed up. This helped narrow down the time frame when she was killed, from 6:30 to 9:15 in the morning, when she needed to leave to make it to the salon. Since Ryan had an alibi and Darren didn't, Larry's thoughts moved in the same direction as the investigators. Darren must have been the one to kill Sandra. There was no one else. Sandra's friend confirmed that many of her friends were convinced Darren would be arrested and convicted. The children would be placed under the custody of their grandparents or Sandra's brother, and everything would be resolved. But the police were in no hurry to press charges. Then, a year after the murder, news of an arrest spread. But it wasn't Darren. The island of Kauai is unique in many aspects, particularly in its lack of mass media. In most cases, news spreads the same way it did generations ago, through word of mouth, where facts, rumors, and speculations intertwine into a single narrative. Thus, across the island, new information began to circulate. FBI agents had arrested Ryan Shinjo. However, it wasn't in connection with the murder, but rather with illicit substances. Ryan turned out to be a member of a major organization smuggling these substances to the island from Honolulu. It involved significant amounts of money and serious shipments, and FBI agents had been monitoring Ryan for months. Rumors and speculations began to spread across the island. Could Ryan have used his girlfriend as an unsuspecting carrier of the goods? After all, he bought her Louis Vuitton suitcases. Did she unknowingly bring something back from their trip that she wasn't aware of? What if she discovered the truth and she was killed to prevent her from going to the police? Rumors abounded, but the police didn't come any closer to catching the girl's killer, whoever they might be. The case faded away with each passing year. Meanwhile, Larry and Toshi faced the painful reality of not only losing their daughter but also their grandchildren. When their mother was killed, they were only 3 and 5 years old. Darren no longer needed to fight for custody, and he raised the children on his own. Initially, the grandchildren would visit their grandparents on weekends, but within 3 months, they started protesting against these trips. Larry persisted in trying to maintain a relationship with his grandchildren, but it was evident that Darren was turning the children against their late mother's parents. Darren himself appeared everywhere with his new girlfriend Sharon, whom he knew even before Sandra's murder. Then, in 2009, 3 years after his daughter's murder, Larry began to conceive a dark plan for revenge for her death. Fortunately, his plans were put on hold when a new police chief arrived on the island of Kauai, bringing renewed hope for justice to Larry. Police Chief Darryl Perry had been enjoying retirement, but returned to work after the sudden loss of his 26-year-old son. Therefore, he understood the pain of a father who lost a child. After a very emotional meeting with Larry, Chief Perry resolved that Sandra Gallus's case must be solved at all costs. The new police chief enlisted the help of 2 friends in Honolulu, investigators from the cold case department, to review Sandra's case. Perhaps they could notice something that had been overlooked, and indeed, they managed to discover something using advancements that were cutting edge for 2009. Forensic scientists had the capability to extract DNA from an item touched only once. With this technology, they found Darren's DNA on the victim's shirt and bra. Larry hoped that they were getting closer to solving the case, and the police thought an arrest was imminent. However, the prosecutor deemed it insufficient evidence because Darren never denied seeing his wife every day. The investigation stalled once again. Years continued to pass one after another. In 2012, the police chief assigned the case to a new detective, Bryson Ponce, who thoroughly reviewed all the evidence. The investigation led Bryson Ponce back to the same two initial suspects. But which one was the murderer? What evidence pointed against Ryan? Aside from his involvement in smuggling illicit substances, there was something suspicious about how he found the girl's body. He couldn't enter the garage through the closed door and had to call a friend who helped him open it. Perhaps he was seeking to secure a witness. Moreover, he clearly had something to hide and failed a polygraph test. But didn't he have an alibi? Here was another twist. As the new investigator discovered, the time of Sandra's death was more of an estimation. She could have been killed hours earlier when Ryan wasn't at work. However, Darren's position wasn't much more reliable, primarily because he provided completely different statements regarding the events of that morning. Initially, he claimed that Sandra had stopped by to pick up the boys. Then he corrected himself, saying she didn't stop by. He also failed the polygraph test. But here's what's interesting. The couple were battling for custody, and Darren had the idea to keep a diary where he recorded all of his wife's shortcomings, such as when she failed to pick up the children on time. He hoped this would help him gain full custody. Reviewing the diary, investigator Bryson Ponce noticed that entries were made every day from January 1st until the 24th. But on the 25th, the day of the murder, it was blank. If Sandra hadn't shown up at all to pick up the children, Darren would have definitely noted it, given how detailed his previous entries were. Such a gift from her side he wouldn't have missed. After all, he couldn't have known about her death until late in the evening at the earliest. Interestingly, he didn't even call his wife to clarify when she would arrive. Perhaps because he knew very well that she would never arrive again. The investigator found something else. Just 3 weeks before Sandra's death, she sent emails to her lawyer describing her husband as a cruel, dangerous man who viewed her as his property and was jealous of Ryan. She detailed how her husband grabbed her, shook her violently, and yelled at her never to call her boyfriend again. He also used the children to his advantage. When Sandra came to pick up the boys at 6 in the morning, he would refuse to open the door for a long time, shouting that he didn't want to wake up so early and demanding that she leave his house because she was allegedly intruding on his property, although he knew perfectly well that the children needed to be fed and taken to school and daycare. After conducting a thorough investigation, Bryson Ponce concluded that on that morning, Sandra did indeed come for the children, but she and Darren had a quarrel, and she was forced to leave without them. Darren, still enraged after the argument, followed her, parked his car on the street a little further from Sandra's house to avoid being noticed by neighbors, and when his wife got out of the car, he attacked her. Then, he simply went back home to the children. The investigator submitted the final report to the police chief and the prosecutor. The district attorney finally agreed to bring the case to trial because everyone believed that no one else but Ponce could do more for the case, and they would not find any new evidence. Darren was charged with his wife's murder. He pleaded not guilty and was released on bail. Sandra's relatives thought that the trial was imminent, but they were mistaken. Unexpected circumstances intervened. The district attorney, who agreed to bring Darren's case to trial, lost during re-election to her post, and her successor criticized her work. He stated that she tried to use the high-profile murder case for her own purposes, hoping it would increase her chances of re-election. The new district attorney was convinced that they would not win the case in court because there were two suspects, and the defense would never let this fact rest. And in this case, the second suspect was a convicted felon serving time in federal prison. The court date kept getting postponed, and Larry Mendonca was not getting any younger. He feared that the promise of achieving justice, which he made at his daughter's grave, might not come to fruition, and these thoughts wore him down. Early in the morning on February 14, 2017, the 75-year-old Larry felt unwell. He was taken to the hospital with a heart attack. It was difficult for his son and wife to see him lying in the hospital bed. His condition was quite serious, but he managed to pull through. For months, he underwent physical therapy to be ready for the trial in the summer of 2017, but it was postponed once again. Meanwhile, Darren, his former son-in-law, continued to live his life, attending his children's football games with his new wife, Sharon. In 2017, Ryan Shindo, who had served 10 years in federal prison, was released and decided to speak with the prosecutor. He revealed that he and Sandra had been afraid of Darren because of his aggressive behavior, constantly provoking Ryan to fights. After one altercation at a restaurant, Sandra shouted at her husband, "Don't you dare hit me, Darren." She confessed that he had already allowed himself to hit her. Despite his criminal record, Ryan was not inherently aggressive, unlike Darren, and fully cooperated with the investigation. Finally, at the end of 2017, the district attorney decided that his investigators had completely ruled out Ryan as a suspect, and Darren could be tried for second-degree murder. Suddenly, Darren's lawyer shocked everyone by stating that his client was willing to make a deal with the prosecution, but on his own terms. He agreed not to contest the charge of first-degree assault. In other words, he did not admit guilt in the murder or the assault. However, he agreed to accept punishment for the first-degree assault for causing serious injuries to Sandra. It sounded like mockery of justice, but the prosecutor still wasn't sure if he could prove the man's guilt in the murder and agreed to the deal. Larry Mendonza was disappointed and angry. In 2017, Darren could have been sentenced to either 10 years in prison or probation. This meant that despite brutally strangling his wife, he might not spend a single day behind bars. Everything was supposed to be decided on May 30th, 2018. Larry awaited the start of the trial with a large support group, family members, friends who knew Sandra, and people advocating for justice. 12 years of investigation condensed into an hour of trial. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Would the judge send the defendant home or to prison? As expected, the defense attorney reminded the judge of the alternative suspect. He also reiterated that this was not a murder case, and his client did not admit guilt in anything, only agreeing to punishment for assaulting his wife. Larry also spoke in court. He was given the opportunity to unleash 12 years of pain and despair, starting from that dreadful night when he informed his daughter's mother of her death. How do you tell a woman that the little girl who once fell asleep in her arms, played on her knees, ran to school clutching the lunch she made for her, is gone? Looking at Darren, Larry declared, his family received a life sentence, full of pain, sorrow, and disappointment. A lifelong imprisonment, forever. Darren didn't react to this statement as if it had nothing to do with him. It was time for the judge's decision. Larry was on pins and needles. The judge reiterated the defense attorney's words about the deal and what the defendant agreed to. The attorney whispered to Larry that it didn't promise anything worthwhile. But no, the judge sentenced Darren to the maximum possible term of imprisonment, 10 years. Darren appealed, and his sentence was reduced, but the 12-year struggle for justice for the Mendonza family had come to an end. Larry, Toshi, and their son Lawrence established a foundation and hold annual golf tournaments to raise funds to help victims of domestic violence and to ensure that the public does not forget Sandra's death. Unfortunately, Larry and Toshi failed to reconcile with their grandchildren, who are convinced of their father's innocence and hate their grandparents and even their late mother. By seeking justice for their daughter, Larry and Toshi foresaw this but couldn't act differently. All they have left today are a few rituals on the anniversary of Sandra's death. They bring flowers to her memorial, dine at the restaurant where she worked, and visit the grave where Sandra rests among her ancestors. Sandra, who longed for her native island while away from it, is now forever a part of it.